My name is Lily. At the time of writing this, I'm a 20-year-old woman who lives with my boyfriend, Ben, and our 3 cats. We live in a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom apartment on the 3rd floor, right next to the outside stairs, and can very easily hear anyone walking up or entering the apartments around us. Our room is right beside the front door, and the window looks out onto the wooden stairs/deck area. A little background/context. A little less than a year ago, I had a stalker. I met him on a popular BDSM site and made it very clear to him from the beginning that I wasn't interested in anything serious, strictly a friends with benefits type of relationship. He was a little odd, and admitted to me he had autism, but I didn't care. I had plenty of friends growing up, and currently who were on the spectrum, and were still functioning members of society, as most are. I hung out with him frequently because of the sex, but also because I was 19 and he would buy me booze with my money. I worked 2 jobs during this time, 1 retail and 1 food service. People at my retail job knew him and suggested very heavily to me prior that he wasn't a great person and to be careful. I started distancing myself from him when he began talking about his severe mental illness, specifically his predisposition to schizophrenia. I told him he needed to seek medical attention if he thought something was wrong and tried supporting him. I tried backing away completely when he admitted to me he had dreams of murdering me and my parents' dog, murdering him and having flashbacks to Auschwitz where he killed children in a past life. Lovely. I immediately cut contact with him, but made sure to record calls and voicemails. When telling my retail co-workers about this, they told me that the behavior was not new. Ben and I had just begun seeing each other at this point, but he, as well as my parents, strongly encouraged that I file the restraining order. I told them that I would think it over, but it was solidified when he showed up to my place of work just to get food. I hid in the back of the restaurant and told my shift leader I couldn't go out there until he was gone. I could tell he was skeptical, but I said it was fine as long as I stayed busy in the back. I called Ben while back there to inform him of what was going on, and after heading up, resumed my job. Ben showed up minutes after and made it very clear to my stalker that I didn't want to see him, but did not threaten him. My shift leader later told me that while making my stalker's meal, he looked 2 co-workers in the eyes and said, "I know Lily is in the back hiding from me." My uncle is a retired lawyer, and therefore helped me take proper action against him. My stalker's lawyer and my uncle worked together frequently before my uncle retired, and struck a deal with my attorney and uncle that if we dropped the charges, he would put the fear of God in him. After all of this, I have yet to see him again 6 months later. Ben and I are both night owls, and also pretty antisocial. It was around 11:30 p.m, and Ben and I were chatting quietly with the lights off in our room. There was a natural lull in our conversation when we were both on our phones, and there was suddenly a knock at the door to the tune of a shave and a haircut. We both froze instantly and stayed silent. There were a few more seconds of silence, then the knock repeated. This pattern continued for about 5 minutes before I started freaking out silently to Ben beside me. We were both stark nude and were expecting no one. Ben and I quietly walked out the room and to the door, looking out the peephole, and saw no one. We were still freaking out and walked to the kitchen and both grabbed steak knives to give ourselves some semblance of a safe feeling. When attempting to go back to our room, the knock happened again twice more, and Ben ordered me to get in the bedroom and hid just out of sight in case something got ugly and needed to surprise attack whoever this was. He looked out the peephole again, and before I could ask him if he saw anyone, he flung the door open and walked onto the balcony, still naked. I hissed at him to get back inside, and he did just that before locking the door again. He said no one was there, and proceeded to lock us and the cats in the room for the night. We really hope it was a case of someone having the wrong apartment. When telling my parents, they were pissed that I hadn't called the police, saying it very well could have been an attempt of burglary of what little valuables we own. Small side note, my 9-year-old sister lives with our grandmother in the same complex and building, but a different apartment. I pushed and asked if she had attempted pranking us, ready to tear her a new one about how she could have been hurt. She very heavily insisted she didn't, because she had to be up early the next day for a summer camp trip. Whoever knocked on our door at nearly midnight, for all of our safety, let's not meet again. I have a schizophrenic brother who started an argument when we were in our late teens over my dad giving me his old iPhone. He decided a rational tactic was to chase me with a chainsaw, then try to chainsaw my car. The police came, but not before he broke my mother's ribs. I've had an intervention order against him since, and no longer consider him family. This happened when I was a bartender about 4 years ago, but I think about it often, and it has changed the way I operate throughout life. I now refuse to go to any store alone after midnight. I was 25, and an attractive slender blonde at the time. On a busy Friday night, I was bartending with the bar manager, and he had noticed that we were very low on some bar necessities after the dinner rush. Lemons, limes, bitters, that kind of thing. So I was sent out to a 24-hour grocery store down the road to pick up the odds and ends that we would require to get us through the weekend. I picked up everything that was asked of me without trouble at the store, until I got to the liquor aisle. There were 2 country-looking guys that were probably around my age in the aisle, and they were staring at me and whispering to each other in a way that made me uncomfortable. So, I assumed they were making comments about me. All pretty innocent so far. Before they could approach me, I grabbed what I needed very quickly and power-walked to the self-checkout. I really booked it out of there, because when you're a bartender, it's kind of like you're on a stage and are required to be charming and interact with people that you otherwise absolutely wouldn't be able to tolerate unless you were being paid to do so. This is another reason why I'm not a bartender anymore. I get to the self-checkout, and hot on my tail are the 2 guys. I'm scanning my stuff, and they use the scanning station next to me. I get a better look at them now, as they are right next to me. One is taller, muscular, and average-looking. The other one is shorter and more plump. They both looked dirty, and their eyes were completely bloodshot. I'm not even sure if they were high or something or had already been drinking for a while. They continued to stare at me, and our eyes awkwardly met. So I did the pleasant, Midwesternly thing to do and flashed them a quick, half-assed, closed-lipped smile to be polite. The taller one starts trying to talk to me. "Hey, looks like you're ready to party, huh?" I replied something like, "Yeah, something like that. It's not for me, though." They walk closer to me and ignore their responsibility to scan their items. "Oh, must be for your boyfriend, huh?" I flash the awkward, tight-lipped smile again and roll my eyes slightly, like, this is your hint that I'm not interested, fellas. The taller one continues to try to talk to me. "You should come hang out with us tonight. We could show you a real good time if you know what I mean." "No thanks, I'm good. Already have plans." Well, the tall one starts to get upset that his moves aren't working like he'd hoped, and starts using a more threatening tone and moves very close to me, literally 2 inches away, but I ignore him, staying focused on the scanner. I don't think he had showered in a few days by the smell of him. He gets a little louder and says, "I see how it is. You probably only screw doctors and rich men like that. You think you're too good for us? We can show you that you aren't. We can teach you a lesson." Now, I'm not sure what context he meant this in, but it definitely wasn't good. Still not looking at him, I turn away, so my body is blocking his view of my purse, which I set on the scanner, to grab my 4-inch pocket knife out and slide it up my jacket sleeve in case I need to protect myself, acting like I'm searching for my wallet. I do this, however, in view of the self-scan worker standing at her podium, and look at her with wide eyes trying to communicate that I do not feel safe and that I might need help. I turn back to the machine and slide my credit card to pay, while the creepy and hostile guys are practically standing on top of me. The machine malfunctions and starts beeping. The lady worker comes over immediately, and the guys standing next to me change their expression from "I'm planning to torture you for a few days and toss your body into a creek" to "just your friendly good old country boys making polite conversation over here." They actually tried to act like I knew them and were friends, so the worker wouldn't be alerted to their ill intentions. They tried joking with the worker, saying I was stealing something and that's why the machine went off. The worker was definitely not buying it. She was a 6-foot-tall woman with some muscle on her. I wouldn't mess with her on my best day. She pressed a few buttons on the screen, shooting the guys a very unimpressed look when they were trying to act charming, and cancels the order completely. She turns to me and says, "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, ma'am. This machine seems to not be working correctly. Why don't you gather your things and I'll ring you up at an actual register." She puts her hand on my back and gives me a wide-eyed look like I gave her a minute earlier, letting me know that she sees I'm in danger. I pick up my things and follow her to a register that's near the security office. The guys linger around the self-scan, still glaring at me, and eventually complete their purchases but stand at the exit assuming they're waiting for me. I felt like I would be walking to my death if I made it to my exit in that moment. The worker keeps a close eye on the guys and scans my items. As she's scanning, she tells me there really wasn't anything wrong with the machine I was using. It just misread my credit card, and she said, "I had a bad feeling about those guys from the moment they walked in, and then I saw them getting aggressive towards you. I already rang security to be ready to walk you to the parking lot and make sure you left safely when you were ready to leave. Then I saw you take that knife out and put it in your sleeve, getting ready to protect yourself. Good girl. As much as I'd like to see you show them, they picked the wrong girl to mess with. I'm glad I was able to pull you aside and make sure you were safe. I see them waiting by the door for you. I'll just keep pressing buttons on the screen and act like I'm having trouble with your order until they give up and go outside. Our security officer and I are both going to escort you to your vehicle when you leave." I thought to myself, this woman seriously deserves a raise. I thanked her over and over again and told her what they said to me, and I was getting afraid because I don't know what these guys are capable of. As I'm talking to her, my bar manager calls me to see what's taking so long. I explain what's happened, and he was obviously very concerned and ready to come up there himself and kick some ass. A sweet sentiment indeed. By the time I hung up, the guys had given up and walked out to the parking lot. The worker said to give it another few minutes because she had a feeling they may still be in there, waiting for me to walk out, and see which vehicle was mine so that they could follow me. My instant thought was, "Now way, they have to have been gone by now." But I was wrong. The worker and security guard escorted me out, and it was after midnight, so you can imagine how empty the lot was. Towards the back of the lot, there sat an old, big pickup truck running with the lights on pointed towards the store. It was a huge parking lot, and it wouldn't have made sense for them to initially park like that. So I'm assuming they moved the truck to sit that way, so that they had a full view of when I exited the store and got to my vehicle. It was like being stalked by hungry lions. When I unlocked my car and they saw that me, the worker and the guard were looking directly at them, and that I wasn't getting in my car until we watched them leave, they then peeled out of the parking lot. I mean, they seriously did a burnout to establish that they were pissed and trying to intimidate us. Poor creeps didn't get their way. I thanked the worker and the guard over and over again, as I'm certain that they had just saved my life, or at least saved me from having to live with whatever those guys were planning to do to me. I did write a long letter to the store manager and their corporate location describing how their employees protected me and how grateful I was. I really hope that earned her a promotion, bonus, raise, or something. She didn't know me at all and was ready to protect me, which really isn't her job, but she did it anyway. Needless to say, I do not go late night shopping by myself anymore, and never will again. I turned 21 before my friends did, so naturally being an alcoholic, I went to bars alone. I was waiting in line one night, and an attractive woman who had clearly had too much to drink came up to me and started rubbing on my chest. I was a single man, so if an attractive woman wants to rub me, I was fine with that. She said how attractive I was, and then started saying how much she missed me. We were strangers. She started then sobbing uncontrollably. By the time her friends had caught up with her and saw her crying, just before she turned and ran away from me, one of her friends chased after her, and the other walked up to me and said, "Sorry about that. Her boyfriend just died 2 weeks ago in a motorcycle accident." She was looking at me kind of funny, but that whole situation was kind of funny, and I said, No problem, and that I was sorry for her loss. She went on to say, "It's weird, can I tell you something? You look exactly like her boyfriend did, like exactly like him. We saw you as soon as she did. We froze and didn't know exactly what to do when she ran up to you." We briefly exchanged pleasantries, and I went inside for a stiff drink. 3 months later, I was hit in a horrific motorcycle crash and nearly died, suffering the almost same fate as her boyfriend. When I was in my early 20s and living in Chicago, I wasn't making much money. When I found this apartment, it was too good to be true. The top floor of a duplex with 6 rooms for $775 a month. The agent who showed me the apartment stressed it to me that the landlords were very religious. I didn't have a problem with that, even if it did sound ominous. The landlords were an elderly couple that lived downstairs. They seemed okay at first. When I saw them in the yard, they'd smile at me. I took good care of the house. Then, when they saw I was having my boyfriend over, things really started to get weird. One day I was in my office writing when I heard a knock at the door. I open it, and it's the old lady from downstairs. Before I can say hello, she says to me, "Have you ever gotten an abortion?" I shut the door in her face. No thanks. This was a colossal mistake. The house was laid out kind of weird. There was a door at the bottom of a flight of stairs that I thought led to a communal laundry room. But after accidentally opening it once, I discovered it led directly into my landlord's living room. And I learned this the hard way. I was in my kitchen cooking. My boyfriend was at work and I was by myself when I heard what sounded like the click of a door. "Okay," I say out loud. "What the hell was that?" I really didn't make the connection. It could have been the door that led to their living room. I walk into their hallway and look around. I didn't see anyone at the end of the hallway, and I poke my head into all the rooms and no one's there. Then I look down the staircase leading into their house, and the neighbor lady is standing there staring at me. I scream. She flinched and stepped back into her apartment and swung the door shut. After that, every time I left the house, and I spent every possible moment out of the house after the incident, I would come back and something would have been moved. A window would be shut. Once the shower was dripping and my towel was damp. I couldn't lock the door because since it was technically a door to their house, they were the ones with the key. The knocking got so frequent, 3 to 4 times a day, that me and my boyfriend propped up an old mattress so that we wouldn't hear it while we slept. The second to last straw was when I opened the door for work and the stairs were gone. I physically could not leave my house because there were no stairs. They had been dismantled and were sitting on their porch. I called them repeatedly, but they didn't answer. Finally, their son came out of the house and explained that they were remodeling their porch. He told me that I had to cut through their apartment downstairs. I descended the stairs and opened the door, and they were both sitting at their filthy kitchen table staring. The phone was in the cradle. They must have heard it. They kept staring at me with this blank look on their face. I crossed their kitchen and left from the back door. A few days later, I came home from my job and noticed the bathroom floor was almost completely flooded, like someone had left the faucet on or the shower on. The old woman, seeing that I had come home, came upstairs and knocked, screamed at me that I had flooded the bathroom and that her son had come to fix it. I was so run down at this point that I told her it was okay. Her son comes by a few hours later and he is stupid drunk. I open the door and tell him that I need an hour or so before he comes, and he picks something up and swings it at me. It was a massive wrench. I somehow duck out of the way and he stumbles over, and I book it down the narrowly repaired stairs as quickly as possible and call the cops. They come by and take down a complaint, but claim since there was no physical contact they couldn't do anything. I later learnt that the old couple has a daughter on the force. In the middle of the night, me, my boyfriend, and several of his friends packed all of our stuff into a Chevy Astro. We lived in hotels in the van for a month, until we found another house. They never attempted to contact us again. This happened to my dad a number of years ago. He has since passed away, but this story is one that I always remember in my mind as being the one that gave him the most chills. He didn't tell it often, but when he did, and it usually required alcohol for him to do so, it would always give him a look that I rarely ever saw in him. A true and profound fear that we as a family rarely ever saw, and a particular vulnerability that was very unlike my father. But now, onto the story. My dad was working in the army. I can't say where, I don't know if I can now. In any case, he never said specifically where. This must have been at least 50 years ago. He was on patrol on some rural area of the base. He was led to believe and understand that the area had previously been somewhat inhabited. The land was repurposed as a base, and the subsequent houses in the rural vicinity were either destroyed or just left. I think there were about 3 houses that were in the woods which were already overgrown and abandoned by the time the base was got, where it was considered too much work to go about bringing them down, so they were left there as edicts to what came before. My dad was doing a patrol one night in the dark. He said it must have been past midnight, and he was by himself, on a little vehicle, making sure that everything was in order. He was relatively bored and just listening to the sound of nature, when suddenly he spots something out in the woods. He jumps off his vehicle and shines a flashlight towards the woods, where he clearly sees something move. He radios in to say that he's seen movement, and he starts making his way closer. He sees and hears footsteps and movement, the swish of a robe, it seems. My dad walks near to one of these old houses, and he illuminates the house. He doesn't see anyone inside, but now the intruder, person, is gone. He makes his way towards the house, which he had never done before, and is feeling a bit apprehensive. Even though theoretically there should be no one there, it still gives him the creeps. He opens the door, which was unlocked, and shouts out to reveal themselves and that they were trespassing. But there is no noise whatsoever. He looks around the house, the musty smell invading his nose, and his ears only being filled with the footsteps he himself makes in this sinister house. It's very small. He clears every room downstairs and starts making his way up these thin, rickety wooden steps, which he was dubious would hold his weight, but he needed to do a thorough inspection, as protocol demanded. when he reached the top of the stairs, he noticed there were 3 small rooms. He went into each of them in turn, and upon the last room, saw a small ladder and an attic leading up to it. He had a really bad feeling. The hairs on the back of his neck were standing on end, and he really didn't want to go up those stairs. But he knew he must. So, up he went. One of the stair rungs actually broke under his feet on his way up, which nearly gave him a heart attack, but he soldiered on. When he made it to the top, he shined his flashlight all around, and as expected, heard and saw nothing. Just a few old children's toys and sheets and stuff, nothing of real interest. He did see something though. Maybe there could be someone hidden behind the sheet. The attic was quite small, and so he made his way in and pulled back the sheet to reveal nothing. Satisfied with his search, he made his way back down out of the house. He hadn't got any response via radio yet, which he thought was odd, but brushed it off and made his way back to the vehicle. Just as the keys were entering the ignition, did he hear something again? He looked over and saw a shadow move. He shined his flashlight in the general direction and saw that again it was heading towards the house. This time he ran, convinced he was going to catch whatever or whoever it was. He ran, but when he reached the house, it was gone. He used his flashlight to shine all around the house, not wanting or thinking he should go in, seeing as the door hadn't made a sound as it squeaked like hell the first time he entered. When he'd pretty much done a whole lap of the house, he decided to give it up. He wasn't sure what it was, and thought that it would be best to leave this to someone else. Just as he was rounding the house to go towards his vehicle, did he hear a light tap on the glass of one of the windows. He knew something bad was about to happen. He said he could feel a distinct chill in the air as he twisted his head slowly, and his eyes saw red eyes in the window. It wasn't so much the eyes themselves, but the dark shadow of what appeared to be a body, absolutely towering over him. It was behind the window, at least 8 feet tall. As you imagine, my dad promptly crapped himself and ran as fast as he could to the vehicle, and drove all the way back. He told absolutely no one this story. It took him a number of years before he even shared it with us. But a few years after, while out with a few drinks with a few colleagues of his, did one of them bring up the abandoned properties. They asked the usual questions about if anyone had been in one, and my dad piped up. He said he thought he once saw something while doing an inspection, but it turned out to be nothing. One of the members of the group went silent, and then asked, "Did you see the eyes? Were they red?" The others in the group didn't know what they were talking about. Something in the house, perhaps? And my dad looked him square in the eyes and just nodded. The nod was so much more than a nod, charged with comprehension and understanding that they had shared in the same disturbing experience. They never spoke any more about it, but my dad admits that it was something truly disturbing, and never inspected any abandoned properties again. My husband was a trucker with a cross-country firm at the time. His driving partner separated from his girlfriend, and according to my husband, couldn't afford to get his own place. I did find that odd, as he made as much money as my husband, who clearly could afford the roof over our heads. My little one was a newborn, and I was off on maternity leave. So Buddy moves into our spare room and makes himself at home. And I do mean at home. He'd walk into the living room and change the channel while I was watching TV, or turn on the stereo, fry himself a steak as a midnight snack, or eat an entire box of donuts and thought nothing of it. He'd take a shower and drop his dirty clothes on the floor for me to pick up and wash. And he stared at me a lot. I found him creepy and inconsiderate and told my husband so, And finally, after a few months of arguing about our unwelcome charity case, who never paid a cent, I told my husband it was either him or me. This sparked a huge argument between the two of them, with Buddy accusing my husband of being whipped and not standing up for his friend. That did it for my husband, and he told the guy he needed to get out now. My husband drove him to a hotel, and we thought that was the end of it. The next day, we went to get groceries, as I had stopped buying anything but essentials so Buddy would neat us out of house and home. Imagine our shock when we get home and Buddy walks out of the kitchen wearing my husband's clothes and smoking his pipe. As you can imagine, feces hit the fan, and I went straight to the kitchen and phoned the police. In those days there was no 911, so it was taking a bit, and he heard me talking. He bolted out the house and we never saw him again, and he never showed up at work either. We discovered that he had broken a basement window to get in, so we boarded up the basement and changed the locks. Around a week or so later, I decided to use my cash nest egg that I had stashed in my underwear drawer, and it was gone, and I realized several pair of my underpants were gone as well. Gross. I considered phoning the cops again at that point, but we decided we didn't want to remind him of our existence, and we moved shortly after. I hope the next tenants never got an unexpected and unwelcome house guest. My wife went to university with a woman who had a big, jagged scar on her throat, and one day she told her how she got it. Some guy followed her when she left school, grabbed her from behind, cut her throat, and raped her. She woke up in the middle of the attack and got her thumb into his mouth and ripped his cheek open, gave him a full-on Joker scar on one side, which distracted him enough for her to get away. The idiot misogynistic judge gave the guy a reduced sentence because she was unconscious during most of the rape, so didn't suffer as much. I despise judges who give lenient sentences to rapists and other violent men. I chatted to my wife about this, and she also mentioned that he originally got 6 years, but she and her family appealed the leniency of the sentence and got it increased to 7. Some justice was at least served. I work as a security/nighttime attendant at an apartment building. It's 24 stories and one of the oldest in the city. One night I'm sitting here when the phone rings at about 3 a.m. and I answer. Hello, this is Daniel at front desk. How can I help you? The voice on the other end sounds female, but was totally garbled, and the only bit I could make out was 23rd floor. I tried to tell the person that I could not understand them, and asked which apartment they were in, but again garbled a response, and I just made out 23rd floor. After the third time of trying to understand them, and the same response, I said since I couldn't understand them, I would go up and meet them in the hallway. So I go to the main elevators, and surprise, surprise, they are both on the 23rd floor. Fortunately, we have an older service elevator, and it's only on the 7th, so I call it down, get it, and hit the button for the 23rd, but it won't move and the inner door won't close. So I go to unlock the reset panel, and boom, we start going up, door still open. I'm freaking out a bit, and the elevator is shaking because it goes pretty fast and is old. As I'm ascending, I just stay towards the back, and finally, I reach floor 23. I step out, door closes just fine, and I look around the hallway. There's nobody around. I walk along slowly trying to listen for anyone awake who might have called, but there's nothing. So now I head in the opposite direction and go towards where the regular elevators are, and when I get to them, they are just sitting there, with their doors open. I was pretty freaked out, but I knew it would just be the elevators going fritz, so I get in and figured I'd just reset them, and get them to floor 1, when I heard the sound of the back stairwell closing. I quickly get out, go to the stairwell, and lo and behold, there's no one there. But the maintenance door to the machine room is ajar, and at that time, I'm the only one in the building with a key. At the top of the building is a large machine room, housing all of the really loud machinery that does stuff in the building and allows access to the roof. I don't like going into there because it's creepy as hell, and no one ever goes in there. So at this point I'm seriously freaked out, but muster up and head inside. "Hello?" I shout, but to no response. The lights in this room flicker because they're terrible fluorescent, so I can't see well either, but at the end of the room I can make out the roof access door, and sure as hell it's slightly open. So I slowly continue forward, checking the space in between each machine as I walk by, to make sure there's no one there. And there isn't. I open the roof door access. I can't see anyone ahead of me on the roof, but there is a slight wraparound, and if there was a jumper or something, I needed to be sure. So I step out and leave the door ajar like it was. Almost immediately, the door is pulled shut. Now I might have written it off as wind or something, but this door is hard to shut, and really hard to open. Really hard. I immediately grab the handle and hank it open, slam it behind me and run straight for the maintenance door. It automatically locks when it's closed, so I slam it shut too and go back to the 23rd floor hallway, get into an elevator, which the doors are still open for, and go all the way down to the first floor. I go back to the main lobby, and as soon as I sit down the phone rings. I pick it up, don't say a word, and sure as hell, garbly voice again. The only audible thing I can hear is a voice saying, 23rd floor. I hung up the phone, turned off the ringer, and spent the rest of the evening just staring at the parking garage security monitor. There's been a bunch of creepy things happening in this building. It's basically like the Overlook Hotel at night. I walked past a dark room here on the first floor once, and swore I saw myself standing inside it. The next night as I'm inside said room cleaning, the lights flip off, and I turn around to see a quick flash of myself walking past. There must be some creepy ghost or something playing games with me at work. Why was it trying to lure me onto the roof of the building? I can only speculate. Perhaps it wanted to throw me off. I went to Germany for a work trip. It was company affiliated, and a fun competition between several teams around Europe and us. Our first night there I went out with a buddy of mine, hitting a few small bars after dinner. I had a few beers but was pretty sober, and was taking care of a friend who was pretty drunk. At the last bar we each ordered a beer, and halfway through it I suddenly felt drunk. From sober to drunk in half a beer, my mind must have already been messed up, because I basically ignored it, and I let my friend walk off back to the hotel by himself, when he told me he wanted to leave. In any ordinary situation, I would have gladly went back with him then. The next thing I know, I'm walking up the sidewalk outside somewhere, with my wallet and over 100 euros in it and cell phone gone. Pieces of what happened start coming back to me, and I see flashes of being held down on the ground by 3 or 4 people while they were taking money. I'm pretty certain that the bartenders are responsible for drugging and robbing me. Afterwards, I remember finding a police station and trying to explain to them what happened, but they treated me like a drunken arsehole and told me to piss off, and literally pushed me out of the police station. I finally managed to stumble my way back to my hotel, and have no idea how I made it out and found it. I was in a very paranoid state the whole time. Eventually, I hit my bed and passed out for 20 hours. I had just moved out of a share house in the suburbs, and into my own crappy 1-bedroom apartment in the city. I am a male, and at the time was around 25 years old. My apartment, while old and small, was located about 500 meters from one of the most popular night spots in the inner city. As I was in my mid-20s and out on my own, This was the perfect place for me. This was because my friends and I were quite social and would frequent bars and nightclubs in the city, and the taxi fares were starting to add up. Also, this new apartment was close to my work, so the move made sense. I got settled in right away and invited my friends over for pre-drinks before hitting the clubs. Due to the limited space in the apartment, this means that some friends were inside and some were drinking on the walkway just out front. We had the music up and had just started drinking, but between songs I could hear the couple next door arguing. Now the apartment was old and crappy, which meant thin walls as well, so I pressed an ear to the wall in order to listen. I hadn't met any of my new neighbors at the time, as I didn't take too long in moving in, and I didn't see anyone during. I was curious. Judging from what I could determine while eavesdropping, there were a gay couple in their early 30s. One of the men was yelling at the other to go next door and tell us to keep it down. The other was arguing that it was just a housewarming and to let it go for the night. Since I didn't want to cause too much trouble, I marshaled everyone outside to start making our way to the club, leaving my new neighbors in peace. Later that night, I came home alone as I was tired from the move and decided to let my friends carry on partying without me. I arrived at my door and proceeded to fumble around for my keys, when I looked up to see a man standing on the walkway in front of the next door apartment smoking a cigarette. He was tall and thin with brown, oily hair. I noticed that he had a cut lip and a faded but still visible black eye. "Good day," I said. "Sorry about the noise earlier," correctly assuming he was my neighbor. He replied, "Nah, you're right, mate. I'm Chris," and he shook my hand. I noticed his knuckles were red and a little bit scratched up, so I knew something was off. I apologized for the noise and said, "I hope I didn't cause any trouble for you." He withdrew his hand with a soft but cracking voice and said, "Nah, it's alright. Rick just gets a bit cranky sometimes, I'm used to it." With that, I finished off the conversation and told Chris that I'd see him later. It was about 2 a.m. at this point, and I just wanted to sleep, but couldn't help worrying about the potential domestic abuse going on next door. I decided to keep an eye on it for now, as I didn't have all the info. For all I knew, he could have gotten into a fight with someone else. As the weeks passed, I noticed that my new neighbors got drunk regularly and would argue almost every time. I could tell that Rick was the dominant one, as his voice was a lot deeper, and Chris seemed to be afraid of him during their shouting matches. This is why I kept my distance and never really socialized with them. I would even overhear them arguing about me, and that Rick thought that Chris liked me, etc. I would just tune out all of this with headphones and video games, not to mention an active social life and full-time work to keep me occupied. I did find myself avoiding having guests over because of the neighbors. I would opt to meet people out, as their arguments would be quite upsetting. This was working out fine enough until Christmas Eve that year. I was arriving home after having come from some last-minute Christmas shopping. I was getting ready for a night of present wrapping as I was to visit my family the following day for Christmas. As I arrived home, I noticed 2 police cars outside and Anna, an Asian woman who lived a few apartments up from Chris, screaming. I asked her what happened, and all she said was, "It's just so sad," while sobbing. I could see 3 officers trying to restrain someone, and there was blood on their uniform. I came just a little bit closer to see Chris's oily brown hair in the center of the affray. His face was bleeding from his jaw where he had apparently been slashed by something sharp. They got him to his feet, and I could see that his cheek had been cut so deep the skin was flapping open as he struggled and resisted with the police. I recoiled in shock, and I went to comfort Anna, who was crying uncontrollably at this point. Suddenly, Rick's voice boomed out of nowhere. "You see what you've done? You loser, just kill yourself." This frightened me, and my instinct was to get me and Anna to safety. Even though the cops were here, they had their hands full with Chris, and I certainly didn't want to get involved in such an ugly fight where knives were involved. Anna refused to come with me and said she would be fine. I looked around to see where Rick was, and he kept yelling at Chris the whole time. The 3 cops struggled to restrain him, and I could hear Chris whimpering apologetically in between. I couldn't see where Rick was, so I decided to just go to my apartment and lock the door. As I turned to go, I froze, as Rick's voice boomed, "Where do you think you're going?" A chill went down my spine as my brain struggled to reconcile the fact that these words were coming from Chris's mouth. I felt panic grip me as I realized that all this time Rick and Chris were the same person. All the fighting, laughing, drinking, and carry on that I couldn't help overhearing the last couple of months had come from one solitary person, a lonely guy in his small 1-bedroom apartment. For some reason this made me feel sick. I later learned from Anna that this wasn't the first time the police had come out to take Chris away. Anna explained that he spent a few months at the local psychiatric hospital each time. His father owned the apartment, so it was here waiting for him when he got out. I moved out a few months later, and while it's a sad situation for Chris, I really do feel for him. I was by myself in the engine room of a submarine on the mid-watch. Just a newly reported sailor trying to find equipment, so that I could display my knowledge to one of the watchstanders. There are a number of bays in the engine room lower level, with narrow passages that pass through the center. I came down one of the ladders, and I swore I saw someone walking across the ship about 15 feet in front of me. I could hear his footsteps as he walked around the corner and out of sight. 3 problems. 1, he was wearing utilities, an older light blue blouse, and dark navy slacks. Nobody has utilities anymore. They had been phased out 3 years earlier. 2, there was only one other person awake in that engine room that late at night, and he was standing at the top of the ladder behind me, waiting for me to come up with the answer to his question. 3, he wasn't actually there. I wrote it off as sleep deprivation, but I'll admit, it shook me for a while. Fast forward to 4 months later. I had gone out to sea with another submarine of the same type. While I was there, I met a sailor who had previously served on my ship. After a few weeks of standing watch with him, he told me a story of a sailor who had committed suicide while on watch when he served on my ship almost a decade earlier, in the engine room, in his utilities. I wish I could have gotten a picture of the look on my face. I'm sure it was the definition of disbelief. I was a domiciliary carer in a small town in the UK. This meant I had to go from house to house to provide personal care and support for elderly and disabled people in their own home. My shifts were variable from a nice and easy short to a lengthy split shift. This meant I started at 7 a.m. in the morning and finished at 10:30 in the evening. One day my manager called me in the office to have a meeting about a couple of new clients, which a few had fallen off my route that day. She handed me over the care plans and other files including care notes, where you have to document everything you have done to the client on the time of visit, including personal care, housekeeping tasks, and documenting medications. So she told me to have a nice late shift and sent me back to work with the brand new client. As I found the address, I was a bit creeped out by the look of the client's house. It was a detached 2-story house with an untidy, abandoned-looking garden. Windows were opaque from years of dirt built up on the glass panes. The staircase windows were covered with sheets of building site plastic wraps, and I opened the gate and walked to the side of the house where the main entrance was. The door was a simple UPVC door with a door cam fitted to the right side of the frame with a doorbell button. I pressed the button, heard the doorbell ring inside, and shortly after a vicious dog barked from inside. A few moments later, a middle-aged man looked out of the window from my right side of the door and asked me, "What do you want?" I introduced myself as Frank, and that I was from the care company, and that was here to help him in his daily life. He reluctantly let me into his home, and as I entered, the hairs on the back of my head started to rise. The inside of his house was a huge mess. Dog hairs covered the floor in thick layers. The smell of untidiness was overwhelming. I need to describe the layout of his home for you to understand. As I stepped in, on my immediate left, there was the staircase leading to the upper floor, barricaded with a child barrier. On my right were a wardrobe for coats and shoes. In front of me were the door of the living room and the lounge, and on the far right was a short lobby leading into the dining room and kitchen. So my client invited me to have a seat in the lounge and we started to talk. The guy seemed okay, and I had a chat with him, mainly to convince him about the service we provided, and he needs it because of his living conditions. The conversation went fine. I had spent my allocated visit time just to make him comfortable with the service we provided. Everything went fine, so my unease had gone, and I realized my allocated visit time had drawn to an end. I had to say goodbye to the client after I was done with my care notes, and I have another route for the next few weeks, and had completely forgotten about that creepy house and the rather creepy man to take care of. When I noticed in my schedule that I have him again for 2 hours to spend, like cleaning his home and such, no personal care was in sight because this client was very shy. When I go, I'm given the task to vacuum his dining room, which I started doing, but the vacuum cleaner didn't work. I wondered why. I turned the vacuum cleaner over and saw all the brushes were thickly covered with dog hair. I cleaned it out as best I could and started to clean his dining room out when a big chunk of grey carpet was ripped off by the vacuum cleaner. I freaked out. I had now destroyed his carpet. When I realized his carpet wasn't grey at all but a nice magenta. It looked grey because of years' worth of dog hair stomped into the carpet. I grabbed a knife and used it as a spatula to try and get the dog hairs out. When I loosened up the dog hairs, I started to roll up the carpet. It was so thick. I took it out to the front yard, as the backyard was an utter jungle with overgrowth and weeds, as well as other vegetation. It was impossible for me to move in the backyard. Then I was greeted by his next door neighbor, Jack. "Hello, how are you doing? Are you moving Joe out?" he asked, as I returned his greeting and said, "No, I'm just cleaning out his house. I'm only here for domestic reasons." "Well, good luck with him," Jack said. The unease had returned to me, but I tried brushing it off. I managed to clean his dining room and make it look like a dining room instead of a dog kennel, and I wrote in my care notes and moved on to my next client. The following week I had him again, and my next task was the kitchen, so I started to clean up the rather messy kitchen. The washing up sink felt like I was working in a sewer instead of a sink. When I finally managed to clear up the mess and clean and tidy Joe's kitchen cupboards, I went to rinse my cloth out when I saw him standing at the kitchen door. I did not realize the situation at my first glance, so I turned to the sink to rinse the cloth when I felt a chill go down my spine. He had a machete in his hands, grasped very tight that his fingers were going white. I looked at him, and he stared at me, but not with the glaze of a nice gentleman, but with a glimmer of insanity in his eyes. I glanced at my watch, and my visit time was near its end, and I said, "Look, Joe, my visit's over. My other clients are waiting for me. Will you let me write my care notes and grab my coat and car and leave?" He didn't answer, nor move. He just kept staring at me with that insane glance, my eyes darting between him and the machete. I moved forwards towards him and he backed up, but kept staring at me with the insanity in his eyes that got worse with every second. I went into the lounge, not taking my eyes off Joe, in case he were to charge at me. I grabbed my coat that had contained my car keys and flat keys and my ID, put it on, then slowly walked out of the lounge. Joe was standing at the lounge door with the machete in hand, ready to stab. I walked steadily towards him, and he backed up into the kitchen's lobby. To my best of luck, as he forgot to take his keys out the main door, as I walked towards the main entrance, always facing Joe. I reached the front door, turned the keys and opened it, backed out, down the 2 steps he had in the front door to the driveway. He started to come after me but stopped at his front door, and he slammed on his front door so hard that the glass pane just exploded out the door. I backed up to the front yard's gate, then opened it, when dread got down to my very bones. His dog was unleashed and charging at me with a frothing mouth. I was able to shut the main gate right before that dog reached it. The dog collided with the gate with a very loud crash, barking at me ferociously. I opened my car, then started it up, and didn't even care about traffic on the main road. I reversed into full throttle and then sped away from the creepy house. I wrote everything down on my notes, and all that they said to me was, "Oh, he has a mental illness." A few weeks later, I was sacked because I refused to work with him again. I worked at a small family-owned bicycle shop. My boss, the father of the family, was a pretty nice guy, as far as I knew him anyway. One day I was rearranging displays and my boss's wife and kids were there. It was a pretty normal day until someone slammed the shop door open and emptied a full pistol clip into the shop, specifically at my boss. I got one in the stomach as soon as I knew what was happening, and I waited until I heard the guy run away. My boss was shot a few times in the head and chest and was obviously dead on the spot. His daughter got hit in the upper arm, and the wife broke her arm diving to the floor. It happened in Iloilo, Philippines around 2015. Apparently, it was about my boss not paying money he owed to the guy that murdered him, and I still don't know if they ever caught him. Working in the 3rd largest building on the planet for floor space. It's about 3 a.m. on a Sunday, and I'm walking down an aisle into the middle of my department. At this time the place was nearly vacant as it was a holiday weekend, and we had only myself and a skeleton crew of maintenance workers under my direction working in another department, all of whom were males. As I'm working by my offices on the plant floor, the power goes out, and the plant drops into the most absolute darkness I've ever experienced. Power gone, I hear the various machines spinning down to rest, and the silence becomes overwhelmingly relative to the background noise I'd gotten used to. The faint sounds of running water become evident in the moments after the blackout, while I'd begun searching my pockets for my phone and the flashlight it offered. As my hand found the phone, a scream erupted from somewhere nearby. Muffled and distant, it was the kind of scream you hear from a 5-year-old girl in her first haunted house, as the bloody clown steps around the corner and fires up a chainsaw. It startled me so badly. I immediately dropped my phone into an alternate dimension. The scream continued, a constantly fading note that seemed to be moving away from my position. Panicked and terrified, I fumbled around the dirty floor for my phone and found it seconds before the emergency lights lit up the plant with the eerie glow of yellow light. Sweat beaded on my forehead as I looked around me. Muscles tense and ready to defend myself against whatever this was. I tried to radio a few times before I realized that the power outage meant the digital frequencies were useless without the receiver up in the main office. I started to move through the various production lines towards where I assumed the scream had originated, mind working furiously. I had no women in my crew tonight, and we were the only people allowed in the plant. So where had the scream come from? Details began to press into my mind, that I hadn't noticed before. The apparent youth of the voice behind the scream made no sense, and it was a scream of pain, the kind you cannot even attempt to control. It had faded away from my position gradually, and then trailed off, as if she had run out of breath. As I stepped towards two products on one of the final assembly lines before a wide open space in the next apartment, the emergency lights dimmed, that audible electricity buff filling the space around me. Struggling to understand what was happening, my senses were again knocked askew when the normal plant lights blazed to life above my head, leaving spots across my vision for a moment and forcing me to raise a hand to shield my eyes. As the shadow crossed my vision, I saw it, or rather, I saw her only for a moment. She stood there, hands outstretched towards me, a vague outline partially hidden behind one of our products. Dark features were the only distinguishable characteristics I can remember, as my reflexes in that moment had been to blink against the bright lights, and she was gone after that. To this day I have no idea if what I saw was real or if I had imagined it. No tales are told to the mysterious young woman in the repair hall, not by anyone but myself. No one knows of any deaths matching her description in the area, or ghosts known to haunt the plant. Not a soul has heard a scream in the darkness, not before, during, or after those black pre-dawn minutes. Believe me, I tried to find anyone with information that might explain what I saw, all to no avail. I'm left wondering with a memory more crisp than any photo I've seen, of that young woman standing in the distance, her arms stretched towards me. Needless to say, I did not revisit the location of said event, ever, because notes don't get any bigger than that. I was acquaintances with an engineer who worked with a friend of mine. He had a bad drinking problem, compounded by the fact that he was one of those people who could drink for hours and appear relatively sober, then suddenly be slobbering drunk. Bars would overserve him because of this. One night in winter, well below freezing temperatures, he did this. The bartender notices how drunk he's suddenly acting and cuts him off. He gives him a water and calls a cab, but has to take care of other customers as well. When the cab gets there, the drunk guy is nowhere to be found. He'd slipped out and driven off. On his way home, he put his car in the ditch in his drunken stupor. He got out to walk and ended up slipping down a creek bank. At that point, he apparently curled up around a tree and went to sleep. When they found him the next morning, he was just a solid block of ice frozen to death. An engineer in a moderately large town in the most modern country in the world, and he still died of exposure. Several years ago, when I was 25, I lived with my best friend at the time. Our friendship eventually started to dwindle, as it usually goes when you move in with a good friend, so she was rarely home. This night, however, she ended up staying up at our place, heading to bed early. I was a server at the time, so I stayed up pretty late, usually watching YouTube or smoking pot. This night was no different, except for the fact that my neighbors tried to take me. I'll go ahead and give you some background info on my house and my neighbors. We lived in a 3-bedroom house with 2 bedrooms and the kitchen facing the crazy neighbor. They were a younger couple living in a small mill house. They were constantly coming to our door and asking for handouts. Now, normally I'd be happy to help a neighbor out, but they would come over and ask for crazy stuff. For us to, fill up an old Mountain Dew bottle with water because theirs got shut off, beer, and once, literally, to ask for $1. They would constantly be knocking at our door to ask for help, and when we wouldn't answer, I'd peek through the window to see them either jacking cigarette butts from the ashtray or pressing their eyeballs against the door peephole to see if they could spot us. Anyway, there I was smoking some weed and watching YouTube on my couch when I heard a knock at the door. I rolled my eyes because I knew exactly who came a-knocking. It's 11 p.m. I checked the peephole and sure enough, the boyfriend was on my porch. Normally I'd just walk away and continue with my life, but he looked like he was in distress. I opened the door up to see what was up. "Hey, I just wanted to come over and see if you could film my engagement. I got my girlfriend a ring here in my pocket, and I need you to follow me to the backyard to film it for me." Baffled but curious, I told him congrats and said that I'd be out in a second and that I just needed to put my shoes on. I shut the door behind me and locked it. Quickly I ran to the back room that looked out onto their backyard. I peeked through the blinds to see the setup. Nothing. Pitch black darkness. No sign of decoration or anything like that. Naturally, I woke up my roommate and told her what was going on. "Yes, screw that," she said, and we both walked back up to the door after the boyfriend started banging on it. I looked through the peephole again and couldn't see anything, and I was confused all the way up until he pulled his eyeball away from the peephole. I quickly turned around and put my back against the door. My roommate came running back to the door from hers, manning 2 wire hangers for protection. We both clung onto the hangers and set up against the door until he finally left. We were so freaked out, but we wanted to make sure we were overreacting. We went out to our back door and hopped into her car so we could do a drive-by, as they always had their front door open and also didn't have any blinds, so it was easy to see into their house. Slowly we crept by in her car and peered into their living room. Sitting on the couch, and all staring at the wall, looking super strung out, was the couple and an older man. We sped off and ended up staying at a friend's house that night. I never answered the door for either of them again. One day I came home from work and an older lady was parked in their driveway. She walked up to me as I got out of my car and asked if I knew where the neighbors were. I told them I hadn't seen them for a while, and she informed me that she was the owner. She told me they were months late on rent and finally came to evict them. She entered the home to find it completely trashed. Needles, garbage everywhere, holes in the walls, and literal poop on the floor. I told her I was sorry to hear that she had to deal with all of that, but I was happy that they were finally gone. I'm not sure what was going on that night, but I'm glad that I didn't follow him into the backyard. My friend and I had a sneaking suspicion that he was going to take me, and that could have been the end of me. I'd like to share with you an extract from my grandpa's memoir. It goes like this. There was an incident during my time stationed in Guam back in the 1960s. I'm unable to explain very well. One day we got a call from a farmer claiming that something fell from the sky and landed on his farm. We knew no US satellites had gone down, so it was most likely Russian. We get out there to discover this small object. It was about the size of a baseball, completely clear, and on one side it had a waffle-like imprint on it, as if it were attached to a grid. Physically it felt like glass. We didn't know what to do with it, and one of our officers was an astronomer, so we presented it to him. He kept it as a paperweight. One day while speaking to him, I accidentally knocked the object off his desk, and it looked like it was cracked and about to shatter to pieces. About 5 minutes or so after, the object was clear again. All the cracks were gone. We struck it a few times again just to watch the object fix itself. I ended up telling my buddies about it, and they wouldn't believe me. When the officer was off base one day, we snuck into his quarters and took the object. Everyone then proceeded to try and break it, but it would keep fixing itself. We stopped doing this when someone had thrown it so hard it bounced off the cement and dented one of our fighter jets. Word about the object spread quickly. The local base newspaper even did a story on our incident, after the officer reluctantly allowed it. Days later, some men, purporting to be from Weapons Bureau, showed up on base. Not only did they confiscate the object, but they tore through our quarters in order to find every issue of the newspaper which was printed. After that, we were told everything we had seen and read were classified, and to this day, I'm unable to explain the object's unique properties. I was about 5 years old when my dad and I drove up to my sister's high school to pick her up from sports practice. He asked me to walk to the gym to tell her it was time to go home. It wasn't dark outside, but it was well after school hours, and there weren't people milling about on campus. Everything was quiet, and there was no one around. I was walking along this outdoor breezeway when this older man approached me. He had dark, wavy hair, a big mustache, tight jeans, and a paisley brown and cream shirt. I can still see him in my mind today. He stopped me to supposedly ask directions somewhere, and then he started asking me other questions. He squatted down to my eye level and asked me how old I was, what grade I was in, and finally what my name was. When I told him my name, he said, "Hey, that's my name too, isn't that cool?" And I believed him, and asked if he could walk with me. I remember feeling very uncomfortable and intimidated, but I was going to go with him anyway because he was an adult, and it never occurred to me that I didn't have to go with him. I was supposed to do what adults told me, in my little kid mind, and if I didn't, well, it meant I had bad manners, and I took pride in being a polite and well-mannered child, something other adults would often compliment about me. And then there was the fact that he had been nice to me, so I didn't want to be rude to him. As I started to walk with him, my dad suddenly came rushing up, took me by the hand and said something in a harsh tone to the mustached man. He quickly turned heel and walked away fast, and I remember being confused, because even though he made me feel weird, he had been so nice and friendly, and now he was rushing off without even saying goodbye. Still, I was relieved that my dad was there because it meant I didn't have to go with this man who made me feel uncomfortable. I come to find out my dad was parked in a place where from his car he could see me still, so when he saw the man squatting down to talk to me, he knew something was off and that I could have been in danger. With the benefit of hindsight as an adult, I feel without a doubt that this man was a child predator, and I shudder to think what could have happened had my dad not seen what was going down and come to my aid. This isn't my story, but my cousin's. She was married to a crazy man. I won't go into the detail about the way he was, but it was awful. He was insane. Also, before he married my cousin, he had another family who all died in a house fire. All 4 of his children, and his previous wife. We all felt bad for him, for suffering such a tragic loss, because we didn't know what he was like behind the scenes at home. We never suspected anything off about that, just thought it was a tragedy. Well, finally my cousin decided to leave him. She took her 2 kids and moved away. She had to leave abruptly, so she was missing a lot of important things, social security cards, birth certificates and stuff like that. One day after things cooled down between her and her ex, she arranged for her to go over to their old house and gather the rest of their things. He asked them to bring the kids because he missed them. Luckily, she decided to let them stay at their friend's house instead. She went over to the house and he was absolutely enraged he didn't bring the kids. He shot my cousin 4 times and then shot himself in the head. He was planning to do a murder-suicide with the whole family. That's why he wanted the kids there. My cousin was shot twice in the neck and in the face and arm. Somehow, none of the bullets struck any major arteries or anything, and she was able to make it to the next-door neighbor's house to get help. She survived the murder-suicide attempt, and her ex didn't. The whole thing really makes me look at that house fire tragedy a little differently. When I was 17, I was an IHOP server. I absolutely loved working the graveyard shift. The money was good, I had great regulars and lots of fun drunks. Whatever. Well, it's 4 AM and we need to cut our cook on Saturday night. Problem is, it's 2 hours before his wife wakes up, so he has to chill for a few hours in the restaurant or get a ride home. Well, the cook had been doing our manager a favor by coming in, so she asked me to take him home. I asked him where he lived, and he said North Tulsa. Okay, so anyone who knows anything about Tulsa knows that North Tulsa is where all the gang shootings and violent crimes happen. South Tulsa is where all the rich people live, and where we were. Upon hearing this, my manager, who's a mama bear type, is like, no, absolutely do not take him home. I laugh her off, and see that the cook is pretty desperate, so I say I'll drop him off. She looks really disturbed and tells me to hand over my apron with all my cash in it, and she tells me that I can get robbed. Best if they just take my wallet and not the $130+. Cool, whatever, just don't be stupid. I know about North Tulsa, and I know that it's all highways to get to his house, so I go, take him in my huge suburban SUV, and take him to his ghetto neighborhood. I get turned around on the route back, and ended up going to a gas station for directions. I go to a Quick Trip, which is one of the nicer gas stations, and park my car in the front glass door, when I see two women at the payphone out front, and don't think much about it. I lock my doors, roll up my windows and get inside, get directions from the dude at the cashier desk, and get back to my car. And the two women are nowhere to be seen. So this is how it goes. I get in my car, check my written directions, and then notice something in my rearview window. I turn around, and there are two people crawling out from my back seat into the seats just behind me. They knock over a box of VHS tapes that I was getting rid of as they crawl over the seats. I had forgotten that my trunk doors don't lock. My horn in my car doesn't work, but I flicker my headlights right into the Quick Trip, trying to get the guy's attention. These are the women from the phone booth earlier, and both of them seem like they're high on something because they're giggling like nuts. One of them is just reading my VHS tapes out loud and throwing them. The other one, jovial, just insists, "Hey, we need a ride home." So being scared does stupid things to you. Like, I know that this was stupid, and I should have just gotten out the car. But instead, about to wet myself, ask her where she lived. "Just down the road." In the rearview mirror, she looks like she's really messed up on something. Her hair's looking nasty, her clothes are all dirty, and in hindsight, I'm wondering if she's homeless. I keep flicking the lights, and when it seems like nothing is happening, I bolster myself and pull out of the parking lot. Whatever, I'm gonna be just fine. Just drop them off, I say. And then she says, "That's right, girlie." And that makes my skin crawl, and I drive her in the direction she's pointing. So we drive, and drive, and drive. It's dark. The highway is long. And the other one is like, "Ask her for money." I'm feeling petrified. I feel like it's been 10 minutes, then 15, and all they're doing is messing up the back seat of my SUV and telling me to keep going. Eventually we get to this country road, and there's nothing I can identify out here. The roads have potholes, and I'm trying to think fast. I start seeing dilapidated houses and motorhomes. They're taking me somewhere, and I don't know where that is. And just as I'm lost in my thoughts, the first one leans real close to me between the seats and says, "Are you scared, girlie?" Let me tell you, those 4 words nearly made me wet myself. I slam on the brakes at that. Fear does stupid things, and looking back I can see how dumb that was. But you don't know what to do when you're scared until you're there. She's thrown halfway into the front seat, and the other one is cussing her head off. I start slamming on everything, making my 5'8" self seem as big as scary as humanly possible. I slam the glove box over and over again, and I'm screaming at the top of my lungs that I have a knife and to get out of my car. I have a knife, when in fact I don't have anything. I just started kicking and thrashing and screaming and cussing. It's all kind of this crazy fear-induced mania, and eventually one of them figures out how to unlock the door, and they roll out my car with half of my VHS tapes onto this country road. And with that, I slam on the gas and drive off as fast as possible. I am terrified to turn around, and at some point I find the highway again. I'm still just as lost as before, but I don't stop for directions, and it takes me a good 45 minutes to figure out how to return back to the IHOP. To be honest, I'm so mad at the guy at the cash register, but I don't know what was up. My manager is getting off shift, and she had thought I'd died. I remember being so damn happy to see her. But hell, fear is a stupid thing. I used to work in downtown Detroit. This was my first job. My old unit used to be a children's ward back in the early 1900s, and there are numerous reports of people seeing a little girl running around. At 2 a.m, one of my IV pumps starts beeping, so I go into the first room and find that for some odd reason, it had infiltrated. As I'm placing a new IV, I notice that my patient is staring hard into the corner of the room. He finally asks me, "What's that little girl doing on the ceiling?" I literally thought I was going to lose my mind. I walked out of the room, and as I'm telling my coworker about the creepy experience, the IV pump in the room right next door starts going off. Walk in to find her IV had gone bad too. This woman had severe dementia, and would just talk a whole bunch of gibberish, like no real words. It just sounded like mumbles. So right as I'm about to put her IV in, she goes, "See the little girl? See the little girl? Where's the babysitter?" Seriously, so done. I just wanted to walk off the unit and never come back. This is a story that my cousin shared. He had joined the army and was stationed as a craftsman, basically a private in the engineering division, and he had signed up as a mechanic for an apprenticeship. They were sent to Thailand for some kind of training and had a weekend off. Naturally, they went and got absolutely smashed at the bar. The night was over, and they were walking back to their accommodation along the beach, when a Thai man walked up to them and pulled a gun. He was attempting to rob them. In my cousin's words, had he not been so absolutely hammered, he would have just given him his wallet and walked away. Instead, his drunken ass wrestled the gun out of his hand and just yeeted it into the ocean. Then he shoved the dude onto the sand and laughed before walking back to the accommodation, realizing how absolutely idiotic he had been the next day. I mean, he was savage and incredibly lucky, but there's a very good chance he could have ended up dead and forgotten on a beach somewhere there. I grew up in rural Texas, in a small town, with a crippling meth problem. No positive outlets for people to do activities like a movie theater or park, and we didn't even have a large grocery store just to hang out in. The teens mostly just ended up drinking, driving, and going to bonfires, but quite a few of the teenage boys in my neighborhood decided that being evil was the best way to have fun. They would literally go out of their way while either trying to drive and swerve and scare younger kids riding bikes, or poison loose dogs and even set fire to a few of the trailers in my neighborhood, while people were still inside them. Only one arrest was ever made in connection to the arsons, but it had definitely been a group activity. My neighborhood was a trailer park, in which each trailer was placed on a few acres of land, with at least some forested area between each plot of property. The road was an older dirt road with gravel and rocks poured over the dirt, which is what I had to learn to ride a bike on. It was difficult. One day when I was around 10, I was doing my best to ride the bike on this rock road without falling while riding away from my house when I saw my older sister, who was about 16 at the time, sprinting alongside the road towards me from the opposite direction. I was going very slow, trying to keep my balance, but decided to just get off the bike when I noticed how panicked my sister looked. I saw a dust cloud coming from the road, but a fairly large hill was blocking the view of my sister from any vehicles that were coming towards us. When my sister got to me, she grabbed my arm so hard that I winced in pain, and she pulled me away from the bike. By this time, the truck that was producing the dust trail was just coming over the hill, but it was still fairly far away, so I didn't think they noticed us. There are woods around 10 feet on both sides of the road, where I and my sister were, as my sister was pulling me into the woods on the left side of it. I complained and was asking her what was going on, but she told me to hurry. We made it about 30 feet into the woods when my sister dropped to the ground and pulled me with her. She covered my mouth and told me to be quiet. Again, I complied, and I saw the vehicle she was worried about. A black truck filled with 5 guys that were in their late teens or very early 20s. The truck screeched to a stop right where my bike was, and I froze solid when I heard my sister whisper, "Crap." 3 of the guys got out the car, but they didn't say anything. It was clear that they were looking very intensely into the woods on both sides of the road. Luckily, for some reason I'm not sure of, they all lined up and started approaching and walking into the woods on the opposite side of the road. They were talking, but we couldn't make out what they were saying. I was worried that they would take their time looking for us, since only a handful of people lived this far down the road, and it could have taken hours before another car would pass through. It took about 5 minutes of perfect stillness and silence before one did, though. One of the guys had already placed my bike into the back of the truck, and then they noticed another car coming over the hill behind them. They quickly jumped into the truck and sped off. We waited at least 10 minutes before we stood up and started the walk back home, although we walked right along the tree line instead of the road itself, just in case. My sister didn't say much to me, but told my mum when we got home that one of the boys that she had been hanging out with was talking about wanting to kill some of the annoying kids in the neighborhood, and she assumed that it would be a good bet that one of those annoying kids might end up being one of her 3 younger siblings. It could have been any of us, but I was the one that wanted to go ride my bike alone that day instead of playing video games with my 2 brothers. She decided to head home when none of the other guys seemed to go against the guy talking about wanting to kill kids, or even jokingly escalate his desire to kill annoying kids with more detail. She had been running home and just got enough of a head start before the boys hopped into their truck to stop whatever they might have done. The cops were informed, but apparently the boys disagreed, and parents claimed they never left the trailer, so nothing ever came of it. I knew 2 of the boys' names because we lived in the same neighborhood in a small town, and I know they never got less evil. They later invited my sister to a bonfire party everyone was going to be at, but my sister decided not to go, and when she asked all her friends how the party was, literally no one knew about it. This is because she was the only one they invited. She stayed away from them ever since, and fortunately, neither of us lived there anymore. Of the 2 that I knew, one is currently incarcerated for several drug-related offenses, but the other one is still out there. As for the other 3 that were in the truck, I have no idea where they are or what they're up to. So to the garbage boys in the truck, you can keep my bike, because I hope we never meet again. I'm a military police officer in the US Army, and have had a few weird and spooky things happen to me on my shift. 1. I was stationed at Fort Riley for my first few years. It's one of the oldest forts in the Army, and was the last stop for people heading west in the old frontier days. Half the post is from that time with buildings made of limestone blocks. I've heard talk that limestone gives paranormal activity more power, but I digress. There's a house there known among the military personnel as the Asbestos House. Supposedly there was a lieutenant that lived there during the Vietnam era, and he'd snapped, killing his entire family, and hang himself in the basement. The army cleaned it up, and a few years later another lieutenant was living there and killed his family and himself in exactly the same way. The army hasn't had anyone live there since, due to the asbestos, or that's what they say. The issue was that if there were asbestos in the house, every house in that street would have been contaminated as well. But this is the only one that had asbestos in it according to the army.
We'd always get calls to the area though. The neighbours would hear noises and see lights go on and off, despite no one having lived there for over 30 years. We'd go in to investigate, only to find no one there, and no signs of anyone being there, apart from our own boot prints in the dust from prior investigations. The whole area gave off a really weird energy. My second story is from Fort Riley, which has two main roads leading from older parts of Post to the newer division parts, where the division headquarters and most unit buildings are. One is called 1st Division Road, and I can't recall the other one where this incident took place. Both these roads have really thick forests on both sides, as well as steep hills. So one day I'm called back to the station to take a statement for a missing person report. A guy comes in and says his wife has gone missing and hasn't been in contact with anyone for a few days. I take his statement and file the report. Fast forward a few months and we get a call for a car wreck off the road whose name I can't remember. An infantry company had been doing a ruck march for morning practice when they smelled something rotten. They did a quick search of the area and found a car wreck off the hill in the forest. We arrived on the scene and found out it was the missing wife. I don't know if you've ever seen a mummy without its wrappings, but that is what this body looked like. The smell was indescribable. The body had bloated and popped all over the inside of the car, and we could only identify the lady because of her ID. As patrols, our primary mission was to just secure the scene and wait for the military police to arrive and investigate. Eventually, they found that the woman had been driving drunk, flew off the road and hit a tree in midair, killing her. The car fell at just the right angle off the road that you wouldn't have seen it unless you were out of your vehicle and actively looking for it. She had been there through most of the Kansas summer and was practically skeletal at this point. It was definitely one of the worst cases I've ever seen. A third story. A few friends from my unit and I were talking about paranormal activity, so we decided to try and do some EVP recordings like we saw on TV. My friend Sergeant Cummings had a high-quality microphone since he streams games on Twitch, and we used that. We went into the basement of the barracks and set up our little outpost and tried to contact spirits. The standard, "Hello? Is anyone there?" and questions like you see on TV. We kept at it for around an hour and a half before we called it a night and went upstairs to go to bed. The next day, Cummins called me and said, "Mac, you've got to hear this." So I came by, and he's isolated several audio clips that we believe to be genuine EVPs. It was so hard to make out, but the three words we heard were Army, Society, and Mississippi. The last one still gives me chills to think about. Why? Cummings was from North Dakota, and I from Mississippi.
When I was really small, my parents would let me stay up late on the weekends to watch TV until I fell asleep. I really loved these times, and I would stay up later than anyone else, just because I could. One night I was almost asleep on the couch when I heard a noise on our front porch. It was the sound of our old-fashioned porch swing moving back and forth. I was a little scared, so I crept towards the bay windows of my living room and peeked out towards the porch. Sitting on my front porch swinging was an older woman, probably in her 50s, wearing nothing but a nightgown, covered in blood, and holding a huge kitchen knife. I flipped out and immediately ran screaming into my parents' room, but was too terrified from my words. My parents saw that I was upset, but when I was finally able to tell them what I saw, my dad got really angry at me and told me that it was just a dream and to go back to bed. I refused and kept crying and screaming until he'd had enough and snatched my arm and dragged me towards the front door to prove that nothing was there. I kicked and screamed all the way, trying to make him stop, but he kept on pulling. Finally, when we got to the door, he unlocked it, swung it open and said, "See, there's nothing." To this day, I have never seen the look of fear and shock that was on his face when that woman turned and stared at both of us and slowly stood up with the knife. My dad slammed the door shut, got my mum to call the police while he went and got his gun. He went back to the door with a 12 gauge and cracked the door enough to stick the barrel out. He asked her what she was doing, and she said, "Somebody killed my husband, but it wasn't me." My dad told her the police were coming and she freaked out, grabbed the knife and walked away. The police found her 15 minutes later, trying to break into one of our neighbors' houses. My dad warned my crazy uncle who lived next door what was happening. Apparently he was waiting on his front porch with his shotgun when she walked by. He pointed it at her and just said, "Keep on moving." I spoke to my mum, and she said they never really found out the whole story, but apparently she was crazy and off her medication. Her and her husband got into a fight, and she tried to attack him with the knife, but didn't seriously hurt him. When he got out of the house, she cut herself with the knife, either trying to end her own life or make it look like her husband did it. The police never spoke to us about it, and this is what we've pieced together from other neighbors. I had this neighbor kid I used to play with, a complete psycho. I was 4 or 5, and he was a year or 2 older than me. One day he convinced me to walk well beyond the distance that my parents allowed me without an adult. He wanted to show me something, he said. We arrive at a small lake. He pointed at the water and said, "Look, there's tadpoles in there. Let's catch some." "We don't have a net. You have to jump in and catch them with your hands." I told him I couldn't swim, but he insisted. He told me he pulled me up if I were drowning. I refused, and he kept trying to convince me, but eventually gave up, said I was a coward. A friend of my mum's saw us on our way back, and my mum wasn't very happy about the situation when she found out. 11 years later, I transferred schools and ended up in the same class as him. I figured my childhood memory of him was exaggerated. We spoke about the childhood memories. He told me how one of our neighbors, who was a cop, had screamed at him for no reason because he was playing with a cat. Remember this? I told him it was nice to see he had so many friends. He responds, "Friends? They're not my friends, they're kids. I only let them think I'm their friend." I smiled the whole time and figured he was joking. I later told my mum about having met him and she went quiet. I told her that he seemed to have turned out all right and said nothing more. A couple of weeks later I brought it up again. She said, "As a mother, I'm never able to trust that boy, and you shouldn't either." She went on to tell me how I wasn't able to sleep and cried a lot at night when I was a young kid. Reason being that he had told me he was planning on burning down our house and murdering me and our family in our sleep. And about our neighbors screaming at him. Turns out he was actually torturing the poor cat. After that, I avoided him. Thinking back, his behavior was off even as a young adult. He was clearly manipulative and lacked empathy. I'm pretty sure he wanted to drown me that day and wanted to make it seem like it was an accident. Many of the things he did are the telltale signs of a young serial killer. When I was working as a cop on a military base, I loved working night shift. Didn't deal with 99% of the stuff that day shift dealt with, and what little stuff we did deal with was usually really uninteresting. Well, most every building on base is alarmed, and the alarms are tied right into the desks, so we know the instant they go off. When we get an alarm activation, we close the base, go check the building, pull on all the doors and see if we can get in. If we can, we go into the building and secure it, check all the doors and corners to see if anyone has set the alarm off. Well, one night, I was on patrol with my alpha, or partner, and we get called to respond to an alarm activation at the elementary school. So we go, secure the building, and call in that the building is all secure. No problem, keep patrolling. About 15 to 20 minutes go by, and we get another alarm activation. We get back out there and check, and now there is a maintenance door open that leads into a boiler room. Nothing in it. We close it, lock it, and get out. Another 20 minutes and another alarm. We respond. All the doors are still locked and we can't get in. The maintenance door is locked and we call in the all clear. This time, my buddy and I sit on opposite sides of the school and watch to see if someone is coming and yanking the doors really hard to set the alarm off. We sit there and watch. Nothing happens. And right as we're about to leave, another alarm activation goes off while we're sitting there. We inform the desk that we'd like the building manager on site to help us secure the interior and let us in. Bear in mind at this point it's roughly 3 a.m. The building custodian shows up, and we start doing a walkthrough, checking all the classrooms and checking all the maintenance rooms, and that's when we see one of the maintenance doors open with the lights on in the room. Now this room is literally the size of a closet. We walk down there and look in. No one's in it, and that door is locked when it closes. We look in there and find a single footprint of a bare foot made of water. Left foot, as I recall. It appears to have been made by a small child. It freaked the living hell out of us because no one reported a missing child and the entire building was clear and still locked up. No one left. No one entered. And we checked every inch of the damn place. Literally, a 3-hour deep sweep, including ceiling tiles. Freaked the ever-loving crap out of us, and to this day, my partner refuses to go into that school. Speaking of which, schools really are spooky when they're empty.
I was in the National Training Center at one of the military's training facilities. There are mock towns and villages here, some rumored to be haunted, which may be true. My platoon and I spent the night at one of these mock towns due to rain and flooding at night. I forgot to mention this is a desert with mountains and hills. Well, we took shelter from the rain in a building that was quite lengthy, and it was 2 stories and had an upstairs patio that also led to more stairs to the roof. As we explored the building as we had nothing else to do, we see furniture and a bit of flooding upstairs and downstairs. After a while we go to bed, and a lot of us were sleeping in the entrance room, and 5 of our soldiers were sleeping in a room towards the back of the building. Come midnight, 30-ish of us were awoken by some loud slamming noises that came every 3 minutes or so. Mind you, there was no wind because all the doors and windows were shut. There's also no electricity in these buildings, so no aircon. The slamming noise goes on for some time, but let me tell you that someone screamed out in anger, and all abruptly it stopped for a minute. Then, a lot of heavy sliding upstairs began to happen. The noise was loud, very loud, as if someone or something was pulling furniture or anything heavy around. No one had the guts to go check it out, because as we always say, that's how they die in the movies.
I am a female who was 23 when this occurred back in 2016. I was moving from New York City to Boston. 2 college friends, also female, agreed to live with me, and we started looking for an apartment. We were fond of one place in particular, out in the suburbs next to a forest park. I got talking with the landlord, an older man probably in his 70s, and mentioned that I repair antique dolls. He excitedly said he had a doll his mother's uncle had brought her back from Germany in World War I, and the elastic holding on the arms had worn out. I said I could definitely fix it, and we exchanged contact info. He was firm that my work would have to take place at his house since he was nervous about moving a fragile antique, but at the time I didn't think anything of it. Now that I'm older and wiser, I know doll doctor house calls are not the norm. Ultimately, we went with another place closer to the city proper, But I didn't want to lose a prospective bill repair client, and I called him a week or so after we got settled, and once again he seemed delighted to get his family heirloom fixed. Nothing seemed odd until I asked for his address to work out how to get there. "Don't worry," he said. "I'll pick you up. What's your new address?" My eagerness cooled a bit. I tried to put him off by saying that I didn't want to bring him out of his way, and I could get myself there no problem, but he kept insisting. Never even told me which town he lived in. Just repeated over and over that it was fine, he'd pick me up, and that it would be no trouble at all. Eager for the business, and a bit embarrassed about my paranoia, I caved. I told him my address, and we arranged a date and time for him to pick me up. Over the next few days, literally everyone in my life told me to call and cancel. My housemates asked me if I'd lost my mind. My mum and sister both told me I was driving them mad with worry, and to be honest, I think I was looking for an excuse to call the whole thing off. It just didn't feel right. I called the evening before the appointed day, and left a message saying that something had come up. I added that if he was free the following Monday, my housemate could drive me over, so he wouldn't be inconvenienced, which was true. She offered in a last-ditch effort to make me see sense. The next day, the time we'd picked rolled around, and I was sitting in the living room working on a sewing project, when a car pulled up in front of the house. I looked down, and my heart jumped when I recognized the old man sitting in the driver's seat. He didn't look up, and didn't appear to see me, and just sat there for what felt like a century until finally he started the car and drove off. I never saw him again, and he never contacted me about getting his mother's precious doll repaired. And maybe I was overreacting to an innocent old guy with poor social skills who forgot to call back. But I had a bad feeling about the situation, and ultimately think I did the right thing. The part that creeps me out the most is I almost had this man for my landlord. It could have been fine, or it could have been much, much worse. I worked in a super old hospital as an ICU nurse. One of the older nurses I worked with told me about a time she had a patient family request to have an exorcism for their loved one. They allowed it on night shift when less family were around. The nurse said the family and priest went into the room and shut the door. They heard screams, then a patient in another room said she saw a black figure go through her room. I used to work straight nights, and patient hallucinations are just way more eerie at night. I had a patient watch me put something in the bathroom, and he says, "There's someone behind you." I took the shower curtain and said, "It's just the curtain." And he replied, "No, behind the curtain." I got full body chills. I had another patient detoxing, and she was constantly yelling out. Well, she suddenly got quiet, so I peeked in to see if she was good. She was lying flat on her back, stiff as a board. She sat up without using her arms or anything, like something out of The Exorcist, and slowly turned to look at me. I knocked the hell out of there. Not today, Satan. Working straight nights, I've had my fair share of call lights turning on in empty rooms, radios turning on when no one's by them. Especially creepy when it happens in a room, right after the patient has passed away. This happened during my first year in uni. I lived with 3 roommates at a dorm. A few months into the first semester, one of my roommates had a mental breakdown and attempted to strangle me while I was asleep. I awoke to his hands around my throat, his knee on my chest, and a deranged look on his face. I tried to push him off me, clawed at his face, but to no avail. My eyes started to dim, my hands felt leaden, and I was sure I was going to die. Fortunately, my other roommate wasn't asleep. He was laying under the covers browsing on his phone. The sound from our struggle caught his attention, and after seeing what was happening, he pushed the attacker off me and knocked him to the ground. He then woke up the other roommate, and together they restrained the attacker on his bed and called the university police. They arrived in around 15 minutes, and after we told them what happened, they called the actual cops. My roommate was arrested,
and taken to a police station. There, he had another breakdown and bit one of the cops. He was transferred to a psychiatric facility after that, and of course, expelled from university.
This happened to me about a week ago. I found a summer job at our local supermarket, and about 2 weeks in I got asked to work the late night shift, which is 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. I accepted, since I was in need of more money and hardly ever sleep early. Everything was fine and dandy until about 3 a.m., when a shirtless, scarred-up guy came into the store. After lingering around the store for a while, he quickly came up to the counter, making intense eye contact with me. As I was about to ask him if he needed any help, he whispered, "Don't you dare move." I didn't hear him at first, so I asked him if he could repeat that. At that point he got agitated and yelled, "Make another sound and I will cut you up." In a swift motion he vaulted over the counter, going to the alcohol section, trying to grab a bottle of whiskey. Thankfully the owner has hidden a baseball bat under the counter. The moment he turned his back to me, I took the bat and swung full force at his knee. He winced in pain and tried to get up. I winded my bat again like I was going to hit him, just to see him pull out a homemade shiv of some sort. I let him get up, and the moment he got back up he swung his shiv at me, lacerating my wrist. I pushed him back with the bat, and he ran for the door and got out. The day after, I called the cops and showed them the security camera footage, but they haven't contacted me since. I think it's safe to say I won't be working the late night shift again for a while.
I was stationed at Redstone Arsenal, Huntsville, Alabama, September 24th, 1989, in the Advanced Individual Training Program for Ammunition Specialists. We were sent into the field for our field training exercise later that day in the pouring rain. My battle and I set up our tent at the end of the line, which was located near the edge of the woodline. This was around 8 p.m. Later that night at about 2:30, I woke up and needed to piss. The rain had stopped and the moon was full, and made the field by my tent look blue. As I was urinating, I noticed I wasn't the only one up. I looked into the field and saw a young girl between the ages of 5 and 7 running up the trail towards me. I watched her run past and up the trail into the dark forest. Thinking I must be dreaming, I slipped back into my tent and fell right back to sleep. The next morning I was awoken for duty, and like most men, had to once again relieve myself. I went to the same place as before, and as I was relieving myself, remembered what I had seen that night. I looked into the direction I saw the girl come from, and looked to where I'd seen her run off to. There, up the trail, was a Civil War cemetery. I was totally taken aback, and was telling my battle what I'd witnessed. Other trainees listened and gave their opinions, which was mostly disbelief. But one of the NCOs nearby heard me, and came right over. He asked me to describe the girl, and what time it was. Boy, was he mad. He said that the girl haunts the base, and all the years he'd be stationed there he'd never seen her. Everyone got quiet and walked away. That night, I had fireguard duty by myself, and no one else wanted to do it with me.
Around 15 years ago, my friend Poe picked me up to go nightclubbing. What we did most weekends. This was one of those giant nightclubs outside of town, in the countryside. Poe and I were really enjoying the dancing, no drinking, pulling our best moves and smiling along. For once, 2 guys seemed interested in dancing with us as well. No funny business, unusual but nice and good fun. Come to the end of the evening, Poe and I going to her car in the nearest deserted parking lot. These 2 guys tag along, and Poe asked them how they planned to go home, and the 2 answered that their group of friends had left a while back, and that we had to take them back now. I reply that we didn't have to do anything, to which one of the guys pushes me against the open car door and says, But we're having geese for dinner. I'm creeped out and can't retreat anywhere. Thankfully, my friend Poe closes the passenger door onto the guy's fingers, which made him remove his hands, and I can get away from him. His friend being a lot nicer, Poe gives in and accepts to give them a ride. We were far from town, before mobile phones were that common, and they would have literally been stranded. Poe asked that both of them ride in the back. They settle in the back of the small car, and Poe begins to drive. But after a few kilometers, the two guys start touching our hair and necks and keep repeating, "We're having geese for dinner tonight." That's when we clicked. They were talking about us. We were the geese. Poe kept her cool and casually asked me to put my seatbelt on. The two guys at the back didn't catch up with the comment. Poe accelerated, cheered by our passengers, then slams on the brakes. She and I had our belts on. We were a bit shaken, but the two guys hit the front seats hard and were in shock. Not thinking, I unbuckle my seatbelt, open the back door, drag both of them from the car, and they just stand there rubbing their noses. I climb back, lock the door, and Poe floors it. We shook it all the way back to my flat, and acted totally paranoid for weeks. We never heard from them again, nor saw them at the nightclub. But one thing's for sure, thanks to Poe's quick thinking, we were off the menu. I truly had some messed up neighbors growing up in Russia. My building still had a few alcoholics who would leave and break booze bottles everywhere and piss inside the building. But one man who lived on my floor was infamous in the neighborhood. This guy lived with his mother, who ironically was our building's janitor, although she was nearly fired several times for shirking her duties. This woman made moonshine in her bathtub, which often stank up her neighbors' flats. Her kid began sampling the moonshine early on and was a full-blown alcoholic and juvenile delinquent by the age of 16. He soon moved on to heroin and began beating his mother for her tiny janitor's salary for drug money. One time, he nearly put her in a coma, but she refused to press charges or kick him out. He broke into his neighbor's flat once for drug money and went to jail for that, about 2 weeks I think. We decided to get an extra door for our side of the flat after that. The junkie was a metal grunge fan and wrote band names and Nirvana quotes all over the walls of our already dingy building. Like all the other alcoholics/addicts, this guy pissed absolutely everywhere in the building, even in his own flat. The downstairs neighbors actually had severe water damage because of his piss, and his flat was so foul that the next residents had to gut it completely. This junkie took it to the next level once, and shat all over our floor's hallway when his mother wouldn't let him inside one night. My grandma and the building's other residents demanded for years that this individual be removed from the building to no avail. His own mother, whom he physically abused, defended her precious son at every turn and refused to kick him out or even to send him to rehab. Eventually they fell behind on their utilities and had to relocate to a smaller flat elsewhere in town. They lived there for maybe a year, until, rumor has it, the junkie killed his mother. No one knows what exactly happened, but the junkie was taken away by the cops when his mother died, and he was never seen or heard from again.
I am a skeptic. I still think there are plenty of logical explanations to my story. But that being said, if ghosts are real, that would be the best explanation I could think of. So let's get on with the story. I'm taking you back to summer of 2013. I was a Marine deployed to the Helmand province of Afghanistan. I was in the southern part of the province, attached to the platoon of combat engineers who in turn were directly supporting the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, so upwards of a couple of hundred Marines. My platoon of 42 Marines, therefore, had a lot of freedom, as we weren't directly subjected to the battalion commander of the 2 to 8, and we had our own lot, command operations center, motor pool, maintenance bay, armory, even a volleyball court. We shared a lot with the explosive ordnance disposal, who were way out on the end of the lot. We never really spoke to them, but they were super chill guys, I heard. We'd come out with our respective infantry companies operating. Usually one squad would stay back on Dwyer to man the COC and relax and stock up on cigarettes and dip, as well as sleep in a container with a bed and aircon. I personally hated it. I liked getting nitty-gritty and living in the dirt, and got really bored when I was there, but the gym was sick. Anyway, I'm going to guess sometime in late July or August, I'd been out with the 2 infantry companies for months back to back, and they gave me a month on Dwyer. A death by boredom sentence if you ask me. The rest of my platoon was out on a mission up far north, with my squad hanging back in Dwyer. So it was my night for Firewatch, and I was there with my senior Corporal W and our platoon guide Sergeant D. We were at the Control Operations Center on our lot. Now I know there's a lot of descriptions going on, but our Control Operations Center was a long wooden structure called an SWA hut. It was in the northeast corner of our lot, which was surrounded by a big 15 to 20 foot tall chain link fence with barbed wire atop of it. The space between the center and the fence was no more than 20 feet from the north part of the corner, and from the east part of the corner, more like 35 to 40, not very big at all. We basically squeezed into the corner. On the other side, we had some tents put up, because sometimes our sister company dog handlers would come and stay the night, so it was mainly for them. So I was at the end of the SWA hut, right by the door opposite of the other door by the other side. You could see straight through the other side of the SWA hut, maybe 50 feet from one end to the other. It was late at night. Corporal W and Sergeant D and I were smoking some cigarettes and chatting, which was rare as they were higher ranks than me, but most of that stuff washes away towards the end of deployment. I can't remember what we were talking about, but we were looking at the center, which had all the lights on, and out of the other end we see someone walk past the door very casually. I remember him being Caucasian, having a trimmed beard, and wearing a boonie, and having an M16. So we pop into action mode and go looking for this person. Sergeant D went to the north side of the 20-inch space between the center and the fence, the side the guy we saw walking towards. Corporal W went through the Command Operations Center, and I went round the southern part. All in all, we linked up on the other side, where we first saw the guy not 10 seconds later, as we had sprinted there. It was that quick. There was no one there. We didn't encounter anyone. Sergeant D would have seen the guy. He literally ran into where he was walking. I highly doubt the guy could have jumped a 20-foot fence and vanished. I looked out into the emptiness outside our lot, through the part of the fence he was walking towards, and saw nothing. Just open desert. We each checked every tent. No one, not a soul. When we met up outside the control center, where we saw the guy, I remember he was wearing tri-color camis, which, unless you are MARSOC, Marine Special Forces, you don't have them, and they're woodland green. This guy had desert tricolors, invasion-era camis from 2001. When I told them this, we all kind of looked at each other like, did we actually see a ghost? Corporal W, having a good sense of humor, said to me, "Well, I'm going to bed. Have fun here alone by yourself," and then leaves. And I didn't hear anything or see anything else after that. Although we shared a lot with some military contractors, one of them just popped in to hang out for a bit randomly, and it made me feel a little bit better. I eventually went to sleep that night because I thought, screw it, if that thing kills me, then it's going to kill me when I'm not tired. But I never saw the ghost again, and we never spoke of it. It's not like some secret we all buried, it just never crossed our minds and we brushed it off and forgot about it until recently. But the one thing that strikes me as oddly coincidental is that our Command Operations Center caught fire and burnt to the ground one day and a week or so later. The fire started in the same spot we saw the dude walking to, and where he disappeared. It could have been EOD, at the speed of which we covered the amount of ground only to not see anyone, and the uniform he was wearing are the only two things that makes it very possible that it were a ghost, if such a thing, of course, were to exist.
I'm a short, medium-sized girl. One day around a year ago, I was pregnant and made a trip out to Target to buy some things. I'm a very cautious person and constantly looking at my surroundings with mild paranoia, mostly inherited from my mum, who raised 3 kids on her own. She was always on her guard. I got out of the car, which I parked a little far away from the store entrance, for 2 reasons. I didn't want to get any dents from other drivers, and I tried to get as much exercise as I could since I was pregnant. As I'm walking, I notice a huge red truck with 3 men inside with the windows down. I assumed they were waiting for someone inside the store, but something creeped up my neck when I made eye contact with the driver. I quickly turned away and immediately began to feel self-conscious. A small girl, visibly pregnant, and I suddenly felt so vulnerable. Up until that point, my pregnancy was smooth and had never made me feel like a target. Once I finally got in the store, I felt more relaxed and went about my shopping. When I left the store and noticed the truck was still there, I put my bag in the trunk and got in the car and quickly turned it on and drove away. I noticed in my rearview mirror, the truck was also taking off with only the same 3 men inside. My heart sank. I realized they weren't waiting for anyone inside the store. I got in the lane that can only be a left turn, and they were on a lane that can only go straight a few cars behind me. I thought, great, we're not going in the same direction, and I was just being paranoid. As I passed the light turning, I see the red truck switch the lane I was in to turn left. I sped up to catch with the next light turning yellow, to put as much distance between me and them. I drove a little faster than usual, and realized even if I made it home they could still follow me there, and I would be going back to an empty home. So instead I drove past my street to a shopping center that had a Starbucks. The drive-through wraps around the building so you aren't visible to the main road I was driving in. I'm getting into the drive-through and notice the red truck going on the road I just left. They drive past the Starbucks and I think, good. As I'm still in the drive-through, I see the truck pass by again in the opposite direction, almost as if they were looking for me. I wait in the drive-through for the other cars to leave at this time, and I call my sister and tell her that I'm heading to her place, as I didn't want to go home alone, and my boyfriend wouldn't be home for several hours. As I'm driving to my sister's house, which is about 25 minutes away, my mind just begins to wander. What would have happened if they'd have caught me? Had these men been following me from before? Any danger that could have happened to me or my baby made me so paranoid that I didn't leave my house for the remainder of my pregnancy. I was shaking by the time I got to my sister's and told her all the details I could remember. To the creepy man in that red truck, I've never seen you since, but please, let's not meet. I was in Nice, France during the terrorist attack, and the truck drove past me within meters of where I was standing. At first I thought it was an accident and brake failure, until the police started shouting, and there were severely injured and dead people in front of me and bullets popping off. I tried to help a guy who was badly injured, but he died when we pressed on his wounds. Then a policeman showed up and screamed at us to run, so we ran back as far as we could. It was a surreal and devastating night, and I still have PTSD from it. I was waiting for a hostel in southern France to open, when an old man starts talking to me. I enthusiastically chat, trying to practice my French. In the span of 30 seconds he starts asking what kind of underwear I'm wearing. Then he starts asking if I'd like to touch myself with him. Then he tries to take off my shirt. I'm a guy, by the way, and I yell at him and run away. Ladies, I now understand what you have to go through. The hostel opens and I try to explain in my best French that there's a pervert hanging around here. When I realized I didn't know the adequate French words to express what was going on, I try my best using hand signals, but the woman at the hostel was furious, obviously not understanding, and she began yelling at me, and I just didn't know what she was saying. She didn't want to give me a room, but a boy working there who spoke some English managed to better convince her to rent me a bed. Embarrassed, tired, and disgusted, I went to shower. The showers were outside the dorm, no one was around, so I just went in my small travel towel and took my toiletries. After a freezing shower, I walked back to my room to discover that I had forgotten my key and been locked out. No one is around and I'm just wearing a towel. Finally, I realize I have no choice but to go to the front desk and ask for a key. I go downstairs in my towel and no one's there. Desperate, I just go outside in a tiny towel and look for anyone. The entire staff is in the dining room with an entire Swiss marching band. Fortunately, the angry French lady is near the door, and I gesture for her to come over. She immediately starts yelling at me, drawing the attention of the 100+ people to a guy in a towel. Merde. I try to explain that I forgot my key. She keeps yelling. She must think I'm some kind of crazy perverse dude trying to flash everyone. She finally gives me the key, and I end up getting very drunk with the Swiss that night.
This happened to my mum. A man entered her house just before lunchtime and stabbed her and the maid multiple times. He also kept punching both of them while stabbing them. Eventually he got tired and left. My mum played dead, and then, when she was sure that they were alone, she checked on the maid to see if she was still alive. Both of them survived the attack, but the police never found the guy. The thing is, my mum knows the guy. See, she owns a flower shop and had 2 people working for her. One of them is a nice gay guy, and that guy had a boyfriend. It is the boyfriend who attacked my mum, and my mum told me that he was high and looking for money. It seemed like his boyfriend didn't want to give him money that day, so he decided to attack his boyfriend's employer instead. Since then, my vibrant, outgoing mother became a recluse, and she developed serious health conditions. She is also always in a state of pain, which led to her becoming dependent on pain meds. The meds ruined her livers and kidney, and now she is undergoing dialysis for it. All because some stupid idiot couldn't stand not having a little bit of money for the day, instead of going out and earning it. I'll never forgive that guy. One of my drill sergeants actually has a creepy story from one of his Afghanistan deployments. He was infantry, so being in the field and out of missions for a few weeks wasn't uncommon. One night while sleeping in a fighting position he dug, he felt something nibbling at his feet. He woke up and kicked it off, and what he saw wasn't any type of marsupial, but a little humanoid figure he could only describe as looking just like Gollum. But being in the field with little sleep, he chalked it up to seeing things. A few days later, he and another guy on watch. The other guy pointed out something and said, "What the hell is that?" and pointed at a stone wall in the distance. My drill sergeant looked through his binoculars, and crawling across the top of this stone was the exact little humanoid creature he had encountered nights before.
This night took place a few years ago, while my father and I were living in a small rural town in Alberta. I was fairly new in this town and didn't know anyone but my dad and co-workers. I had found a job as a key holder in a liquor store that closed every night at 2 a.m. My store was located in between a pharmacy and a grocery store, a place well lit, where I felt safe most nights. Not knowing yet that this town was actually known for its drug problem and random creeps. But anyway, on this particular night, my coworker and I had been working late. We needed to finish unloading pallets of liquor, since we had another shipment coming in the next morning. And at the end of the night around 3:30 a.m., I told my coworker that she could leave, and that I was going to take care of closing down the store, which basically meant counting the till and cleaning up, as she was exhausted, and I had the keys of the store anyway. After she left, I quickly finished my tasks, took all my stuff, and called my father. At the time, I didn't have a car, and my dad would come pick me up every night and bring me back home, which was maybe a 10 to 15 minute drive to my workplace. I have an amazing father. In return, I always made sure to be ready and to wait outside the store for his arrival. I didn't want him to have to wait for me, because I knew he didn't have much time left to sleep, as he had to be at work in the morning. I got ready to get out the store, set out the security system and locked the door behind me. Now you have to understand that I wasn't supposed to finish this late at night, and that once the alarm system was on, I couldn't go back inside because the regional manager would receive a security call if I opened the door and the alarm would automatically start to ring, and I did not have the code to shut it, since I never worked a morning shift. The store policy mentioned that if you forgot something inside, you'll have to wait until the next day to get it back. As I was waiting for my dad standing in front of the store, I heard some noises coming from my left. It sounded like someone was breathing loudly. The pharmacy was right next to my store and had these big red columns in front of the entrance, and I thought the noise was coming from around these columns. I looked to my left but didn't see anything, so I brushed it off, thinking that it was probably the wind or just my very tired self imagining stuff. It was almost 4 a.m. after all, and I had worked really hard that evening. After a few minutes I heard the noise again. I started getting nervous. It was definitely coming from my left, and this time I knew that it wasn't all in my head. At that moment I noticed a movement and realized that I wasn't alone. A few meters away on my left, someone was crouched down behind one of the columns, and I could not see his face, only his hands holding one side of the column while he was slowly moving his head to look in my direction. I was terrified, completely paralyzed with fear. I knew my father couldn't be very far away from the store at this point, so I grabbed my phone to call him. My dad answered and I told him to hurry up and explained that someone was hiding next to me and that I was petrified. My dad said that he was going as fast as he could and told me to grab my keys and get inside the store. I was trying to find them inside my bag when I was panicking too much. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't find my keys for the life of me. I felt completely horrified when I realized the man had stood up, still hiding behind one of the columns only a few meters away from me. My voice filled with fear. I asked my dad where he was, and he shouted that he was almost there. I started to slowly move towards the grocery store that was on my right, never turning my back to him. The very tall and imposing man looked at me again, but this time, he got out of his hiding spot and started to walk in my direction with the biggest smile on his face. I can still recall thinking that this was it. I was going to die. I was trying to decide if I should start running for my life, or if it was better to face him and fight him if need be. But suddenly, I heard a big noise coming from my right. I turned around and saw my dad driving as fast as he possibly could into the parking lot, honking and turning his high beam headlights on, I believe to startle the man. My feet finally decided to move as I ran as fast as I could and jumped inside my dad's pickup, tears streaming from my eyes. I watched this man look straight up at us and slowly wave at my father for what felt like an eternity. The creepy man started walking closer towards us, and as he got closer, my father finally gets a good look at the man and said, "Oh my God, girl, I guess you haven't met Peter yet." I didn't understand. My father started laughing, tears coming out of his eyes while I looked up at him, still in complete shock. To me, there was absolutely nothing funny about that moment. A few seconds before, I thought my dad couldn't get here fast enough, and that I was going to be murdered right there, in front of my workplace. My father waved back at him, and we drove off slowly. On our way home, he explained that Peter was a very nice man with a cognitive disability. He said that Peter lived in town, and that every morning he would sit inside the Tim Hortons that was located in the same parking lot as my store, and would ask people if they wanted a hug. He apparently did that every day, and everybody in our small town knew him. My dad told me I should probably give him a big hug next time, and I would get a coffee at Timmy's, since I probably scared the poor man to death. Either way, Peter the Hugger, I'm sorry, but let's not meet again. Well, not while I'm alone, outside at 4 a.m.
My mum was incredibly abusive to me, and on one occasion when I was around 12, she came into my room while I was sleeping. She crept over my bed and looked down upon me. I hadn't been stirring. That is when I felt something pierce my chest. She stabbed me with a kitchen knife, puncturing my lung, which I didn't know at the time. Obviously, this woke me up. I just rolled out of bed and ran around the house screaming. Someone on our road noticed and called the police because of the noise. Just before the police arrived, she started choking me and I lost consciousness. I later woke up in the hospital and mostly recovered. She is now in jail. This is not the only time that she tried, but it was the most dramatic, and the only time she came this close to actually ending my life. If the neighbor hadn't have called the cops, I don't think I would have been able to tell you this story today. I used to work in defense programming robots. I was stationed at an army depot in the Nevada desert, and we had a 4-wheeled robot we were building to guard the bunkers there. We were never told exactly what was in the bunkers, but I can only assume that they were nukes and aliens. Anyway, the robot had a cluster of cameras on it, including an infrared camera. The infrared was really fun to play with at night. It sensed heat, so you could spot coyotes, rattlesnakes, rabbits, and other desert creatures. One morning I walked into our office, and everyone was crowded round the video console, watching the robot's recorded video from a few hours before. The video started with the robot's usual night drive, its mindless route. Then it picked up something on radar, sounded his alarm and sped over to the radar blip to get a bit closer. When he got there, he pointed his color camera, but there was nothing there. He pointed his infrared, and that's when it got scary. There was a ghost standing in the desert in front of the robot. He looked like an old World War II soldier. He was in uniform, with a rifle and a German Shepherd. The robot kept toggling between the color camera and the infrared, and thus the ghost kept disappearing and coming back. Clearly the robot was confused as well. I'm pretty sure the ghost was confused too. Eventually the ghost decided he had better things to do, so he left. The robot then resumed his mindless route. Just another day in nowhere, Nevada.
My wife always tells me I need to make a book about the creepy things I've encountered. I co-owned a local delivery service. There was a woman called Sue who constantly did odd things upon delivery. She was in mid-50s, grey hair, and a solid moustache for a woman, and creepy as hell. She progressively got worse. It started with little odd things. She would say, "Have you ever tried beef? It's delicious." And come to the door with her face covered in grease and say, "It's a new face treatment." One of my favorites was me miscounting change at the end of a long day. I realized my mistake and went to correct it. She matter-of-factly stated, "Laser beams to the back of your head make you stupid," and then slammed the door closed in my face. She once told me, "I once had a party thrown for my many achievements. They turned a basement into a club for me. I go into the basement and there's hundreds of people applauding. When I turn around, Tom Hanks was there, and I said, 'Tommy, you get out of here.'" None of these were provoked or requested conversations, bear in mind. And she just went off and you'd have to stand there and nod along. It kept getting worse. She started tossing piles of garbage outside her townhouse and would drop piles of quarters out of her hand which would roll into the trash pile and then ask you to pick them up. I told all the drivers to refuse and make her get more money. Then one day, it all hit the fan. As I parked, as there was enough blocking my car that she couldn't see where I parked, I hear her scream, "Who are you?" I knock, tell her the total, and she acts like she has the money, and has her hand closed and drops it in my hand. "Nothing," I chuckle. She points to the ground, clearly dazed, and says, "Money. There was something round on the ground, maybe a rock." I state it's not money, and she goes inside saying her friend will pay me. Confused, I question it, and she walks away with an odd look, saying she will find money or he will pay me. I figure she's odd. Screw it. I'm waiting and waiting, and she's closed her glass door, but not the wooden door, and I open the door and holler, "Sue, I need to get going." There's nothing. I peek in to see if something's wrong, and I decide to open the door and go in. I turn to the right and see a couch with her feet sticking out from behind it. I assume Sue had a heart attack and hurry towards her. As I approach, I hear her grunt like an animal, but still only see feet. I round the corner cautiously and see Sue on her hands and knees digging into the ground like a dog. She was grunting, and I see white spit foaming from her lips. She turns to face me, and I've run faster than I ever had in my life. I jumped in my car and did 50 out of there. I called the cops to do a wellness check, but never heard anything from it. I checked the papers for her name, nothing. What still weirds me out is that she called twice a day and never called again after that day. Still gives me the creeps. Sue, never call again. We will not go there, and your existence haunts my dreams. It was around 1 a.m., and my friend heard a noise outside of his front door. His front yard is really dark, so he looked through the peephole rather than opening the door. He couldn't see anything, but could tell something was below the peephole. He decided to open the door slowly, and as soon as he did, an older lady whose face was covered in blood and only wearing a t-shirt, no underwear or pants, tried to run into his house. He slammed the door on her and called the cops. While waiting for the cops, he kept looking out the little hole on the door, and every so often she would scurry back and forth on his lawn. I wasn't there, but I picture it like the alien at the birthday party in Signs. So the cops finally show up and detain the woman, and they get to the bottom of the story. Turns out the woman was his neighbor, and she was extremely drunk. She'd been drinking and locked herself out of her house and tried to get back in by breaking the windows with her face/hands. Side note, the neighbor no longer calls the cops when my friend has parties. There was a girl in the village of my parents' vacation home who was known to have mental health issues. My family never judged her for it. Both my parents are teachers and used to deal with slow students that say some wicked things every now and then. When I was 2, my parents went on vacation, and so did that girl's family. The girl was 12. Both families were having lunch together, and my parents left the girl to play with me. When my sister, 9 at the time, went to look for me, I was being drowned in a water tank by said girl, who was just looking at my sister smiling, saying some weird things. My sister screamed, and my parents and the girl's family went to the rescue in just enough time to save my life. I have no memory of this, so all I know of the story is from what my family told me many times. I haven't actually ever met this girl. Neither have I ever talked to her family. Both families still go on vacation to the same village at the same time, but my parents cut ties with them completely after this. I was living on Camp Lejeune for a spill. One night we went out to Camp Johnson,
and decided to walk through the forestry area of the base. Upon walking, we kept hearing screams and seeing weird things such as orbs, and there was just this overbearing feeling of, well, I can't really explain it. We ended up walking off the path, and that's when we see a woman dressed in white. It was very scary, and I couldn't move any further, so I did the only logical thing and ran. Later I found out that me and my group of friends were not the only ones who had seen the lady in white.
In 1978 or 79, I was working as a nurse aide. I was doing patient care as well as learning to be a medication assistant, or med aide. One day at work, I had one of my patients pass away. We have about half hour to 45 minutes to prepare the body for transportation and family. I had been working with him for almost half hour from the time he was pronounced dead. Side note, at least 3 people confirmed he had passed, when I turned him from his side to his back, and he started breathing again. I stopped what I was doing and started to figure out if I was actually seeing what I thought I was seeing. He was breathing again. I reached out to check for a pulse and I found it. I can tell you at 18 that was the creepiest thing to ever happen to me. I called for my nurse because he was breathing again and she told me I was mistaken and that sometimes the body does things that make it seem that way, but that he wasn't actually alive. She walked over to him to show me and found his pulse. She told everyone that had been notified of his passing, the mortuary, his family, the facility, everyone. After we had both confirmed he was indeed alive again, she had to go call everyone back and tell them that he was alive. But he passed away for the second time 24 hours later, and he stayed dead that time.
When I was a kid, my father got into a relationship with a rather strange but still kind woman. She had a son who was only a few years older than me. At the time, I didn't really think anything of their relationship, but looking back at it, it was very abusive. They got into fights often, most of them turning physical, even when both me and my father were present. The kid would always try to push me over and hit me, but I would never say anything to my father because I didn't want to ruin his relationship. Now, here is where my memory gets a little hazy. My father and his then girlfriend were having a conversation, while I and her son were a few meters away from them. He once again tried to hit me, at which I sat on top of him to prevent that, as I was a really fat kid and he was very skinny, so despite the age difference, this somehow worked. I told him I would let him up if he left me alone, and since he promised to do so, I just sat beside him. He proceeded to get on top of me and strangle me. I remember trying to cry out for help and reaching out to my father, but not being able to make a single sound and feeling like I was being pulled away from him. I'm pretty sure I passed out after that, or at least was very close to it, because after that, the only thing I remember is that my father's girlfriend and her son were now gone. I never saw them again, though the last I heard of them was from years later, after my dad received an anti-wedding invitation from her. From what my dad told me, she was angry at her son, but even more pissed at my dad for ending the relationship. I'm pretty sure he didn't really intend to murder me, I hope. But then again, what was the intention of trying to strangle a 7 to 8 year old kid? All in all, this was surprisingly less traumatic than you think it should have been. As a Marine, I used to have the graveyard patrol shift at the Beirut Bombing Memorial. Part of the memorial is dedicated to a veteran cemetery. Oddly enough, I never got freaked out being completely alone in a remote cemetery, in the middle of the night, surrounded by dense wood on all sides. It was actually kind of peaceful, to be honest. However, one night, I was patrolling near the perimeter fence where some of the oldest headstones are, and I heard the sound of a woman humming. I followed the sound and noticed a light glowing through the vines and brush of a large tree. As I approached, I could literally feel my hair begin to lift, as if there were an electric current in the air. I pushed aside the brush, and what I saw next nearly took my breath away. It was an old, weathered headstone with a large cross etched into the marble. Only the cross was glowing a bright, vivid blue like a neon bulb. The humming was also suddenly much louder and had a weird plurality to it, like it was coming from 100 voices at once. Needless to say, I freaked the hell out, screamed like a scared little girl, and sprinted back to the parking lot. I radioed the guard who was supposed to relieve me and forced him to come early, then spent the rest of my shift in the cab of his truck. I don't think he believed me, but he stayed in his truck and didn't go out on patrol until the sun was fully up. A few days later, I worked up the nerve to return to the graveyard during the day. As I suspected, in the light of day it was a completely mundane headstone. There was no name, only the aforementioned cross. I ran my hands over the stone to check to see if there was maybe some sort of hidden light source or solar panel. But no, it was just plain, solid, unremarkable stone, and the humming was gone too. I eventually returned to my normal shift, but never again experienced anything out of the ordinary. I never learned whose grave that was either, but I find myself thinking about it from time to time. It certainly sounds absurd when I say it out loud, but I suppose it could have been a hallucination or a trick of my brain, but I don't believe it was. I think it was a real ghost or spirit of some sort, but I don't think it was malevolent in the slightest. My neighbors heard me and my live-in perpetrator arguing and struggling, while I was being pinned against the wall and strangled. So my neighbor, being the diligent man he was, called the cops. They came over, but the perpetrator sweet-talked them into thinking it was a misunderstanding, and that it was all over. They left. But one cop had a bad feeling, bless his heart. He told me afterwards, and he waited outside. My perpetrator came at me, dragging a life along the wall, which made a creepy horror movie metallic sound, and I screamed. It was at that very moment the cop broke down the door and saved me and arrested the perpetrator. He spent 3 months in a psychiatric facility, because they admitted to wanting to hurt me some more. Obviously, the perpetrator was my then partner, and I'm glad that relationship is over. I was on one rooftop, on post, with another Marine, and on the building next to mine was a dude smoking a cigarette. I looked at my partner and mentioned it, but when we looked again he was gone. The roof access door for that building was very rusty and loud, so there's no way he snuck out in those few seconds. So, I don't understand how he just vanished into nothingness.
It was winter 2012. I was 18 to 19 at the time and working in a petrol station in an average-sized town in England. It was an okay job, good money for somebody who was at college at the time, and it was just a shame that it was a weekend job. So while my friends were getting drunk and having fun, I was in a petrol station, serving taxi drivers and the occasional drunk. It started off like any other night. Serve people, clean up, do stock and average night shift work, and since it was winter the night was really dark, and you could only see faint outlines of people walking back and forth even with streetlights. The place where I worked was situated across the road from a pub, and had an alley running beside it, leading to a housing estate. Around 3 to 4 a.m. as I finished cleaning a set of shelves, I noticed a figure standing in the alley just out of the light, but just enough to hide his face, but you could make out his clothing. I initially brushed it off as someone waiting for a taxi, as it seemed harmless enough. I sat down in my chair behind the counter and looked at my phone and played some games for a bit. When I looked up, it was 5 a.m. and he was still there waiting, watching me. To make my situation worse, After 5, there's hardly any traffic or passers-by. I had that guttural feeling that he had some harmful intent. I was safe, however, as I was locked in until morning. I stared back in a trance, trying to keep an eye on whatever he would do next. After a while, I needed to use the toilet, so I went and came back thinking he might have walked off, but he didn't. He was still there. I then decided to not do my last job until my co-worker came in to start their shift, as my last job was to take out the fire extinguishers and sand buckets. It got to 6 a.m. and the figure faded back into the alley, and I didn't see him for the rest of my shift. When my co-worker arrived, it was still dark, and I usually walked the 10 minutes back home, but I got a taxi after that shift. I felt that the guy could still be anywhere, just watching me. I told my co-workers and family members about my experience, and they said they personally haven't experienced anything like it, and wouldn't like to either. I was very nervous when doing my shifts from then on, feeling like as soon as I let my guard down he would strike. But thankfully nothing else happened after that, and I quit the following summer to go to university. Safe to say I don't want to meet the person in the shadows from that night.
I used to work on a submarine. There are few things as unnerving and wondrous about the engine room. From 2300 to 0500, alone on watch. When the boat is largely shut down in port, it becomes very quiet. The roving watchers usually make it an hourly game to speed through their log rounds, especially in the lower levels. One particular in port period, the boat was moored in Pearl Harbor, and a few people started complaining about feeling really uneasy. I was on mid-watch as the SEO on evening and senior chief came back to do his required 3 a.m. tour. We saw him walk past, maneuvering on his way to Shaft Alley. That particular senior chief was the crusty old salty type, and would usually spend a bit of time just sitting in the lower levels of the engine room alone to contemplate life, so we expected as much. What we didn't expect was to him to literally run into the maneuvering area a few minutes later. The man was pale-faced and breathing heavily. We sat up straight, our eyes wide, thinking he was about to have to announce and fight some ship casualty. He slumps into the Edo chair. A few tense but silent moments go by. We're on pins and needles. He finally opens his mouth to tell us he saw a ghost in the Shaft Alley. Swears a sailor passes by him as he's sitting on trash in the Shaft Alley. His first response was to call out to the guy to see who it was, but then he realized he wasn't dressed right. He describes what the guy was wearing, the old World War II naval uniforms, so he quickly gets up and catches up to the guy. And he does, catches him all the way up. The guy turns towards the senior chief, looks right at him, then turns away and literally walks through the arse end of the boat. It's now that the senior chief decides it's time to leave Shaft Alley, and promptly does so, swearing up and down that he knows what he saw. I sure as hell wasn't about to leave maneuvering that night to find out for myself. This didn't happen to me but my sister. She was working in a retail sales job at a large and popular mall in a city a few years back. One day, she arrived at the mall for work, like any other day. She stopped and went to use the restroom, the ones general mall goers would use. After using the restroom, she went to wash her hands, when she noticed, in the mirror, that a man was standing behind her. She made eye contact with him and apparently gave him a nod of acknowledgement. The man was apparently holding a garbage bag he had gotten out of the restroom trash can and had fashioned it like a rope. He then proceeded to approach my sister and wrapped it around her neck, choking her and slamming her to the ground. She doesn't remember much, but the security camera showed the man literally choking her unconscious, and then just jump and stomp on her head repeatedly. The man fled, and she was found by another mall goer. covered in blood, her face badly disfigured. She broke her jaw, lost several teeth. Long-term brain damage is still not known. He tried to kill her. He was a complete stranger, but the police think it was a gang initiation type of thing. The guy is now in jail, and will be for a very long time. And my sister has extremely severe PTSD from it.
This happened to me on New Year's Eve a year ago. I was at this party where a bunch of friends had gathered to just hang out, eat and celebrate together. Nothing crazy in particular happened during the event itself, but rather when I was on my way home. As I was walking along the sidewalk, I think it must have been about 3 a.m. or something, I saw this middle-aged man coming in my direction. I thought little of it. I just assumed he was merely passing until I noticed that he was starting to slow down as we neared each other. I think he smiled as I walked past him. Not a crazy smile or anything, so I smiled back. Just as I thought that I'd been stupidly suspicious about this man, I heard him call out from behind me, like he was after me. I stopped in my tracks and faced him to see what he wanted, and I saw him walking back towards me, his arms outstretched. As he stopped in front of me, he reached out his hands as if he wanted to shake mine. This was when I began to get a little more apprehensive about the situation. I'm sure he must have noticed how I hesitated before I decided to shake his hand. I don't want to be a suspicious person, but I considered the possibility that he might be concealing a knife in his sleeve, or his coat, or that he may try to mug me, or something worse. I thought about what would happen if I started to run. Would he just shrug and continue on his way, or would he follow? All of these thoughts flashed through my mind until I decided to take his hand. I thought that I could always pull myself free and run the hell away if necessary. He then started asking me stuff about what I'd been doing this New Year's Eve, if I had a good time, things like that. He was shaking my hand all the while, and even though I was still on edge, I started to realize this man didn't pose a threat to me. For politeness' sake, I asked him if he had a good time too. After a short while, he let go, said Happy New Year, and went on down the sidewalk. He was probably under the influence, but he must have been one of those people who become happy when they're drunk. I felt stupid but relieved too, and continued on my way home. In the end, he didn't mean me any harm. Perhaps he was kind of sweet. I'll never forget the indecisiveness and spark of fear that ran through me at the moment that he stretched out his hand to me. Because who really knows what's going to happen when you meet a stranger?
A while back I was at my friend's house when a guy came in through the balcony glass door. He had to have climbed up 2 stories of balcony just to make it, and proceeded to start yelling things at her like, "Who is this guy?" And I stood up and protected her. It was dark and I couldn't see the knife in his hand, which he then stabbed me with in the face. I never knew the guy, never even met him, or got his name. After I was out of hospital, and started to try and figure out what the hell that was about, our mutual friend told me that he had asked the perp the same question, and his answer was, "I'm going to murder her," but I didn't know that he was there as well. I'm 23, and this was my second time getting stabbed altogether. 5 stab scars in total. Welcome to Finland. I was a young sergeant in 2006, stationed at Fort Bliss. Right outside of Fort Bliss was a training area that was near the Biggs airfield. We were guarding some equipment overnight, so the company wouldn't have to stay. It was me and one private. I told him he would take shifts patrolling, and since we weren't allowed to have cars out there, the other would nap in his car. I woke up to my soldier knocking on my window in complete panic. It scared me at first. Private: "Sergeant, wake up! There's a UFO out there!" "What?" The private points in the direction, and I sure as hell see these lights that seem like they were floating around and then vanishing. Took me a moment as I'd just woken up. That's the Franklin mountain range, You're looking at the cars driving on the scenic route. The cars would be visible and then disappear when they went around the corner, only to turn to appear again when they came back round. I was very agitated at first, but by the next day, it was by far the funniest experience I'd had while at the military.
I work for a medical examiner and used to be on the graveyard shift alone. The first night I was on, at midnight on the dot, our air systems shut off, which caused the vents to warp. That sounded like someone running through the vents in the ceiling on all fours. Thankfully I got used to it, but it definitely was creepy at first. Another night we lost power, and stupid me watching a horror movie, working so hard almost crapped myself when everything went dark, and knowing that a room with about 30 dead bodies in it was walking distance away. That one I stayed in my car for. Not to mention the constant, long, dark, red-lit hallways. Glad I'm not an overnight worker now.
One time I was at an Air Force base in the ROKs, and we had a power outage at night. All of us walked out to our hangar doors to see what the problem was, and we saw a very large triangular shape passing over our hangar. It was a clear moonless night previously, and when we went outside to look, we noticed the starscape being covered then slowly uncovered. No sound associated with the event, other than the normal sounds of the location, and I'll never forget it. I was in Thailand, heading back to my apartment from a popular corner of the bars in Chiang Mai. I went down the same streets and alleys I always did, cutting through the center of the city to the edge of the moat by the Ram Hospital. I passed by the technical college and saw a group of guys hanging out on the corner. I didn't think anything of it as I entered the final alley that would put me at the moat of my apartment. 2 mopeds passed me and went into an alcove to my right. As I passed it, they zoomed out and cut me off. It was at that moment that 4 guys hopped off their bikes and one approached me. "Where are you going?" he asked, and then punched me in the face. I stood there stunned, thinking, did he just really punch me in the face? I look up, and his arm has something in it. In a swinging motion, I did the only thing I thought of at the moment, and put my arms up to protect my face, and I yell out. After several blows to my arms, I turn and run, but his buddies were there to stop me, cutting off my escape. After a few minutes, they hopped on their bikes and dipped. I have no clue why. Maybe it was the yelling, but I looked down at my arm. My left arm below the wrist was cut halfway through. One of the bones was completely exposed, marrow and everything. My hand hanging uselessly at the end. I knew, immediately, I was in deep trouble. I didn't even feel a thing. I have a minor medical training, so I took note that no arteries were severed, but I was bleeding profusely and needed help. I went to the guest house nearby and asked the attendant for help. Poor thing looked faint when she saw me. She got me in her car and took me to the RAM hospital 100 yards away. Turns out the guy swung at me with a machete according to the doctor. I thought it was a cane or rod. So that's my story. It's important for me to say that I stayed in Thailand for about a year after this event, despite my pleas for me to get out of there and come home. I wasn't about to let that ruin my life. Anyway, I have full function of the arm and hand now. After 4 years of drinking to bury the memory, I'm happy to say I started therapy 6 months ago. I quit drinking entirely and was diagnosed with PTSD, obviously. I'm finally addressing the demon who's been hiding in the depths of my mind, and he has his days numbered. My mum had this neighbour who pretended to be weak from cancer/chemo, so her landlords couldn't get mad at her when trash bins were full and the lawn was filthy. She even went as far as shaving her head and fake a limp,
got a cane and everything. Mum baked some cookies and offered to take care of her bins and lawn. The neighbour then spills about her scam. My mum now enlightened about my neighbour, the fault in our stars, bullcrap, and tired of the trash blowing into our yard, called the landlord. The neighbour wasn't happy and would blast music at ungodly hours of the night to get back at my mum. Mum would get frustrated because she worked late and left early, filed a noise complaint to the police arrive, and neighbour claims my mum, an old Asian lady, punched her in the chest. Neighbour wants her arrested. Mum shows cops our security cam footage, no mum punching, but instead finds the crazy neighbour kicking her 9-year-old daughter out in the middle of the night. The 9-year-old is banging on her door, and my mum comes out to check on the noise and tries to bring the hysterical girl inside at 2 a.m. The neighbour comes out and sprays her with the hose. The neighbour was taken away, and the daughter was sent to live with her father. Some neighbours are the worst.
Allow me to preface. At the time I was working nights in the munitions storage area, which is fenced off with barbed wire fencing. The whole area is pretty spread out, with multiple buildings and definitely large enough that you generally drove around to get to other buildings. Due to the nature of the job, the buildings are spread out with clear spaces between them. Anyway, the only people in the bomb dump on this night are the roughly 8 or so of us in my shop, and one guy in control that night. He was in another building, so we had a direct line to him on what we called the bat phone. This was in summer, around 2 or 3 a.m, and the air was very warm and very still with no breeze at all. And we all had the break room door open while we watched a movie. We were on flight line support standby and nothing was going on. Now the rumour was the small building we worked out of had been built by German prisoners of war during the war, and I know for a fact that there were some back then. It was small, with a main break room, small dispatch office through a doorway, and a couple of offices off that one. There were 2 doors, one in the break room and one on the same side of the building in the dispatch office, roughly 20 to 30 feet away from each other. Both had push bars on the inside, but only the break room door could be opened from the outside, as the dispatch door external latch was busted and only the internal bar worked. While all of us, minus the guy locked down in the control building for security, are in the break room, when suddenly a loud ka-thunk, loud as hell, from the dispatch door in the next room. It was like someone was rushing through, slammed the push bar, and the door swung open, and then swung back shut after a few seconds with a slam. We looked at each other and started to check it out. We had mag lights in our crew books, so a few of them grabbed them and swept around the building from both directions. Another guy calls the controller on the bat phone, who picks up and denied that he was messing with us. There was no way he could have messed with us and made it back to his phone in time, let alone doing it without being seen or heard. Anyone with experience knows how sound carries at 3 a.m. in summer. You could hear the code keys being pressed hundreds of yards away, no joke. No way he hoofed it back to the building that fast, gone through all those halls, punched in his key code and got back to the phone in seconds. But the thing that got me was the damned bar. The door simply did not open from the outside, and we all heard the bar get pushed in hard. The door swings open, hangs there for a few seconds and shuts. There was absolutely no breeze, and had there been, it would have blown past us, sitting right in front of the door. As an aside, there would be a random time where I would go to pick up a trailer or something behind one of the other shops at the far end of the bomb dump. As soon as I stepped out of my truck to do inventory, I would get a super bad vibe, and I'm talking the heebie-jeebies, like no other. And as best I can describe it, it felt like something was right behind me and just hated me being there, just seething anger, rage, and hate, and it wouldn't go away until about 15 minutes after driving away from that building. One night, another driver who had arrived there shortly before I had a trailer asked if I had a weird feeling there, which I sure as hell did, and he corroborated it. All of this was on mid-shift, which was 11 to 7 a.m. I heard a few other people's stories about weird stuff that would happen at night, but since they're not my stories, I can't vouch. The only other things that happened to me was I swear I caught the clear silhouette of a guy walking in an open field between igloos. As I turned to punch in my gate code in the corner of my eye, I distinctly caught the motion of 2 legs and an arm sticking out, like someone mid-stride. But when I turned back, I saw no one. It might have been my mind playing tricks on me, but man, that place can be creepy. It's been 15 years now, and I still get chills just thinking about it. I was attacked in a friend's house by an ex-husband. He slit her throat and smashed my face with a box cutter before hitting me over the head with a plate, knocking me out temporarily. He then lit the place on fire with us in it. I managed to wake up and drag her outside, and a neighbor called the police and ambulance. They caught him 2 days later, trying to end his life in a Ramada Inn. We both lived through it, and he is now serving a life sentence. So this is a story that I always think is funny because it's super relieving. It was such a close call. It happened during my mum's junior year of college, 1990, in Boston, while she went to UMass. She was at a nightclub and started talking to some guy. He seemed, in her words, rough around the edges, but nice enough. He was a rough construction worker, 6'4" and fairly muscular, while my mum was only 5'4" and probably 100 pounds, like a stick. So one of her friends was drunk, and the other had gone to hook up with whoever, and they lived outside of the city in an apartment, so my mum couldn't take the subway. The guy offers her a ride, and my mum grew up in a very sheltered existence in Puerto Rico before leaving home for college. Her graduating class of high school was only 27, so she wasn't exactly street smart when it came to strangers. She says okay, but then she knew something was wrong the moment she stepped into the car, and he locked the doors. This was a pretty bad sign. So the guy starts putting the moves on her, rubbing her wrist and arm, trying to say he's going to take her home and show her a good time. My mum's super creeped out, and is frozen because she's only 100 pounds and built like a twig. She starts to argue the only way she can fight back. Right at that moment she hears a, "Hey buddy, what the hell do you think you're doing?" from outside. She sees nothing, only a bush, and this threw the guy off enough that he stopped talking while he tried to figure out what happened. Then some half-naked guy jumps out of the bush in his boxers and starts knocking on the door, and the guy says to my mum to get out angrily and kicks her out, since the guy was almost his size. As he sped off, my mother goes over to thank the guy. As she's thanking him, her friend who'd gone to hook up with someone comes out of the bush wearing her t-shirt and panties, saying how scared she was. So that's the story about how my mum got saved by a talking bush, all because her friend was a total freak, which, in this scenario, was a great thing. I was out in the middle of the Pacific on deployment in 2016, in the smoke pit about 1 a.m. Beautiful, clear night, so a bunch of us are watching the stars. There's zero light pollution out there, and the sky is amazing at night. There was this one bright light that hadn't moved since we got there, when all of a sudden, it flew across the sky super fast, stopped instantly at another point for about 30 seconds before zipping off across the sky, making a turn at an impossible speed, the sharpness and zooming off and then disappearing. Everyone up there saw it and were all like, "Yep, that was a UFO." When I was living overseas, a man broke into my apartment. He came through the window of my studio apartment about 5 to 5:30 in the morning. Thankfully, I was awake. He started to go attack me and strangle me, and I was able to fight him off, getting up to my feet onto his chest and pushing with all my strength. This happened a few times. The only thing that he would say is, "You die," repeatedly. He was slender, and I don't think he was very prepared, and I didn't think he would have expected me to fight back. Partway through this, when I realized that he wasn't giving up, is when I really started to get scared, and think to myself that I needed a plan to get out of there. My friend lived next door, so I decided I was going to make a run for it. Once I stood up, he backed out of the window. I grabbed my glasses and my phone and ran to my friend's apartment. Thankfully, she was awake. I told her what happened and she was like, "You have to call the police." By this time, shock was starting to set in for some reason and my brain was yelling, "Okay, so nothing happened here, I'm fine." But she kept reiterating I needed to call them. So, I decided to call one of my co-workers who spoke English really well and ask her. The co-worker was horrified at what happened and called immediately, and said that she was going to call the police for me and call me back. Once the police arrived, she acted as a translator to tell them exactly what happened. But I really hope he never tried that again.
Every year my family gets together with friends to stay up until midnight on New Year's Eve and have a party. When we do, we usually shoot fireworks and burn our Christmas trees as a normal celebration of the new year. We live far out in the country, and bonfires are normal. Across the street, under the streetlight, there is this camp of sorts where people work. We set off our fireworks around midnight, and there's this guy standing under the streetlight, silhouetted, and he's glaring at us. He was just across the street, but far enough away that we couldn't see his face, along with it being pitch black save for the light of the bonfire. I pointed out, and it freaks us out a bit, but we try laughing it off. After a while longer of shooting fireworks, we look back and he's still standing there. He wasn't there for a long time, just standing under the streetlight, and it creeped us out. Me and the other kids would joke around and yell at him to mind his own business, but he stayed there and didn't stop staring at us. I remember him either laughing or whistling or something. We did it back for humor, but it was quite creepy. He was there for literally hours. Later on, we'd pretty much forgotten all about him, but looking back, he was gone. I don't know who he was or why he did that. This was a few years back. The street lighting he was under is still there today, and I have that very sinister memory. I wonder why he was there, watching us for so long. This happened to me when I was a young Girl Scout, probably around 6 or 7 in the early 2000s. My group and I were going door to door to sell cookies, and we were all walking in groups of 2 to go up to different houses, with the adult leader at the very back of the line. My partner and I went to a house with a woman who answered. She was probably in her 50s and wearing a long, old-fashioned nightgown. We asked if she wanted cookies, and she said yes, but that she would have to grab her wallet. She asked if we wanted to take a step inside while she went to get it, and we said that would be fine. The adult leader was nowhere around at this point. I assumed she was lagging behind with some of the other girls. Then she said something along the lines of, "Oh, I have some cats in the basement. Do you like kitties? Do you want to see the kitties?" And I love cats. Even to this day, 20 years later, they're still my favorite animal. So I begin to take some steps towards the basement door, which was open, and I see the dark steps going down. Just as I'm about to take the first step down, I feel a hand yank back at the coat that I was wearing, around the neck area. It was the adult leader of the group. She was yelling at the woman as she pulls me and the other Girl Scouts out the house. I'm not sure if I would have been murdered that day. I have a brief memory of the woman apologizing profusely, saying stuff like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't even consider that." But after reading many true crime books and consuming content like this, I know now how unsafe it actually was to go door to door selling cookies. It makes me pause and think about how badly that could have turned out for me. I got to my first unit in the army
after basic combat training and AIT. A buddy from basic got there at the same time, and we were put in the same room. The building was about 3 years old, so it was modern, 2-bedroom, shared kitchen on the left and bathroom on the right. My room, and then back to the left. Homie's room back and to the right. His door had this official US Army crime scene tape around the edges. Being curious fresh privates, we asked the senior specialist what it was about, to which they would just skirt around any kind of answer and leave. Fast forward a few months, Homie's moved into his new platoon hallway, and my Navajo buddy from basic moved in. By this point the crime scene tape was removed. He's a traditional Navajo, fairly spiritual type, and starts telling me he gets odd feelings from the room. I'm kind of creeped out by it, because of all the tape, but not terribly worried. Fast forward again, probably about a year in the same room. Homie is at an early morning appointment. I wake up and do my pre-private grooming. His door is slightly cracked, which isn't unusual for him. His toothbrush is left by the bathroom sink, which he usually keeps in his room. I don't think anything of it. He must have just been in a rush, I tell myself. I do a solid of putting his toothbrush where it usually sits in his room, and leave the door in the same position I found it, about an inch open. I go back to the mirror to start my shave, when in the reflection I see his door slam open, slam closed, slam open, and finally crack about an inch to where it started. I immediately left, and got an arse chewing for not shaving. I was around 7 years old, and I'm a boy, when I made friends with a neighbor girl, and we would frequently play together. She had an older brother that was around 12 to 13 who would babysit us during these hangouts. One day my parents let me go over to their place on my own, as their house was in spitting distance of ours, but the brother was the only one home. He assured me that his sister would be home soon, so he lured me out to the backyard. The background, the house was completely fenced in, and all backyard had a tree line surrounding it. He told me to wait by the swings, which I did, and all of a sudden he charged at me with a sledgehammer. I fell in on my back in fear, and his swing landed between my legs into the ground. I ran as fast as I could to my house. My parents to this day say it was just horseplay, but I'll never forget the look in his eyes after he missed that swing. I have an apartment. This lady lived on the 3rd floor. She must have let her cats piss everywhere, because the entire building reeked like cat piss. The smell entered my apartment frequently. When I passed her in the hallway, I would have to hold my breath because she reeked. I dealt with this for 2 years with multiple complaints to the office, until I eventually called animal control. Turned out, she had 30 cats in her apartment. Animal control took all of her cats away. She was evicted shortly after that. I know from talking to other neighbors that this had been going on for at least 5 years before I even moved in, but they had a hard time evicting her because she was Section 8, although I'm sure the apartment manager was very incompetent as well. She even told us that she had been working there for 6 years, and my neighbors were wrong that it had been going on that long. The maintenance guys had to put on masks and rip the carpet up and seal the wood under it, amongst many other things, to make that apartment habitable for future renters. I went on a 3rd date with a guy I met online. Everything up to this point seemed totally normal. We had talked for months before actually meeting due to the pandemic, so at this point I'd almost known him for 6 months. After the date, I invited him over, and honestly my intention was to sleep with him that night. But once we got upstairs I just wasn't feeling it, and told him I wanted to wait. He agreed and said he thought he should go. I walked him to the door, but when I turned around he pushed me up against the wall and started being really rough. I thought he was joking, until he pulled me to the ground and pinned me. Once I realized what was going on, I started and struggled like hell. His eyes turned black, and I could tell he was enjoying seeing me scared. So I tried negotiating, begging, crying, and fighting. He was like a robot on autopilot. At that point, to stop me from struggling, he just started to hit me as hard as he could in the face and head. And I played dead until he stopped. He was so turned on by this act, and it took a split second for him to just get up and leave me there thinking I was either unconscious or dead. I reported it. They got DNA, but he was never caught. Turned out everything he told me about himself was fake, and his phone was a burner. To this day I have no idea who he is or if he'll ever come back to hurt me again. I just had bought a condo, so I didn't want to move, but seriously considered it. Luckily, the building was already in the midst of having more security cameras and additional security measures installed. I got an alarm system, even though my floor is elevator locked and needs a fob to access, but you can never be too careful. Ladies, please be careful while online dating. I guess the moral of the story is make sure you really know someone before being alone with them. Ask for ID, Google them, check their names and details add up, do a criminal record search, and don't be afraid to ask. It's not rude or weird. It's better to be safe than dead. I work at the US Air Force. I'm not allowed to say what I do, but my frame flew in Vietnam and carried dead bodies back, and after Vietnam it was repurposed. All of the older frames from that era are supposedly haunted from dead soldiers. I've spent mid-shift, midnight to 7 AM on these frames, and I've heard people scream out in pain. I've asked for a tool and had someone hand it to me, and then turn around and they were gone. Multiple times you'll hear someone's name being called. I don't believe in ghosts, but those frames creep the hell out of me. I was in a club with a girl who I think was called Caroline, and since I'm not sure, and it was 28 years ago, I will continue to refer to her as Caroline. It was going well, except that I was very drunk, and when we were outside to spend some time together, I sat in a bench and puked. She sat with me a while and wanted to walk me home, but I do not handle vomiting very well, and it was her night, with lots of friends in the club. So I insisted she go back in and I walk it off back home. As we separated, a man came from the shadows with a knife, the sort of knife that has no real use apart from stabbing people. It turns out the club Browns had a gay night on a Thursday, and he was out to murder a homosexual. It was the very early 90s, and queer bashing was sadly still a thing. He was very clear in outlining his plan, and explained to me why he was going to do it, and in my drunken state, I tried to argue that the club was not a gay club and I was not gay. Anyway, look, I had been there with Caroline. He was having none of it, and he worked himself up to this, and was visibly shaking with anxious excitement. He was going to knife me in the face, because I was giving money to a club that supported homosexuality. Also, I was English, which in his nationalist Scottish mind was absolute proof that I was a homosexual. I argued that I was leaving the awful place, walking away, so I was the good guy, not my finest hour. Why not worry about Caroline instead, since she was going back in there with more cash? I was very, very drunk, and while I fully recognized what was going on, I truly did not associate it with any fear of the outcome. It was like watching a scene in a video game. Anyway, this chap asked me which one was Caroline, and I said, "Here, give me the knife, I'll do it." And he did, and I threw it on the roof and walked home. In the morning I remembered it, but was not even sure if it had really happened. But that night I met up with everyone, and I was some sort of hero. Although I really was not. I was an idiot. The highlight in this storytelling was that I had thrown the knife right up into the gutter, It was a pitched roof. Lobbing a knife onto it was not a reliable method of disposing of it, so it should have just come right back down, and then I walked away very calmly. In reality, I turned the way I had thrown the knife, felt a bit sick about it, forgot all about the chap who was going to stab me with it. His decision upon losing the knife was to wander quietly away, saved me much more than any of my own actions, some which appear incredibly cowardly in the light of day. I used to work in a bakery fairly early in the morning. My shift meant I had to come in at 3 a.m, and it often meant I'd be the only person there for a few hours, preparing the breads and whatnot. We opened at 7, so time was precious trying to set everything up for the morning rush of customers when everyone else got there. One of the things that really got to me, though, was the fact that I'm convinced the bakery was haunted. I'd only just started working there, when I'd hear slight taps by the fridge. I'd look over to see if I had put something askew and that it was going to fall off, but there was never anything there. The noise persisted for a few weeks, and then slowly died away, like whatever had done it had grown bored. But the real horror was a few months into me working there. It was roughly 4 a.m. I hadn't had a lot of sleep, as my boyfriend had been over that night, and we'd been watching movies late into the night, much to my regret. I remember groggily kneading my dough, while listening to something on the radio, when all of a sudden a blood-piercing scream came from the toilets. It sounded like that of a young boy. That woke me the hell up. I instantly stopped what I was doing, instinctively brushed my hands on my apron, and started making my way towards the toilets. I shouted out tentatively if anyone was there, but I couldn't hear another thing. Now, this place is small, and it took me a whole 3 seconds to get to where the toilets were located after I put my hands all over my apron. No one. I sat on one of the chairs near the toilet area behind a wall to see if anyone was going to emerge, but nothing. I grew bored, washed my hands and had a good look around the place but couldn't find a thing. That really freaked me out. I went back to my duties, thoroughly creeped and had the music on high the rest of the time before anyone else arrived. I really wanted to ask one of my co-workers if they'd ever heard anything. So I went to one that I got along with really well and asked her straight up if there was anything spooky that happened here at the bakery. She gave me a smile and asked if I'd seen the little boy yet. She said that she'd seen the boy a few times while closing, and asked if I'd seen him too. I shook my head and said that I heard something. She commented that he's quite vocal at night, and to not be frightened. I quit shortly after that. Too spooky for me. I was working in an ice cream / fast food / grocery store when I was 18, wearing headphones and doing dishes when a ragged middle-aged man caught my attention. He was enraged from a high-speed wreck, and he had come into the front of the store, carrying a broom and a knife he had grabbed while in the restaurant. He caught me off guard and wrapped his arms around my neck and dragged me to where the whole lobby can see and shouts, "This boy's gonna die tonight." An off-duty cop happened to be in the lobby and begins somehow trying to negotiate or something while women are screaming and running. The man dragged to the back of the store in a corner where he forces me to lay directly on top of his body and shouts demands at the cop. He told me to scream out for help. He half-assed fish-hooked me, fake eye-gouged me, and smeared his blood all over my face. Eventually I see a SWAT team show up, and they're peeking through the shelves with big guns. For a brief moment, my captor had to rearrange his grip on the knife, so I took a risk and disarmed him with a quick hand twist and slid away between a nearby officer's leg. He was shot 3 times immediately, and I ran outside. The whole thing lasted between 35 to 45 minutes. I always felt that this incident had a bit of a suicide by police angle, because the man didn't even cut me. He fake eye-gouged me and fake fish-hooked me, all to look threatening and dangerous, even with guns aimed at him. And in my heart, I felt somewhat sympathetic. He seemed so desperate. Also a police violence angle. Ultimately, I disarmed the man fully and escaped before he was shot. And also the particular officer that pulled the trigger had shot a dog in the past. The whole thing started in a different county, and the police allowed the high-speed chase to cross county lines before he eventually had a high-speed wreck in front of the ice cream store. Around 2015, I was in the truck training a new airman on flight line driving at night when we were doing a routine inspection on the equipment out there. He knew what he was doing, so I just stargazed, like I like to. It was a clear night, so it was perfect. After a minute, I noticed the stars were disappearing in clusters and reappearing after a second, and realized something really dark and large was gliding over the top of us. I told my co-worker to look at it, and he saw it too. It was this giant crescent-shaped thing just flying silently overhead, west away from the mountains. It was seriously bizarre. I've never seen anything like it before, and still have no idea what it was. I should probably ask him if he remembers it. This happened to a friend of mine. She went to university with me, and she always seemed relatively level-headed. But then she got into the escort scene, and her behavior started to act up. She was making loads of money, and instead of paying off her uni debt like I said she should, she began splashing out on loads of stuff. But she was relatively young, so I kind of get it. Anyway, one day she tells me that she's agreed to meet this guy as an escort. You know, go out with him a few hours, and that she might meet us at the clubs later, but that she'll tell me how it goes. I don't hear from her that night, and come home, and don't think anything more of it. The next day, she's not at uni. She wasn't around campus, but I didn't find that particularly odd. It's not until the news hits, and I see her face on the news. Turns out the guy who she had been escorting with had taken her to his apartment. She had gone all the way up, and something or other had happened, and she ended up squeezing herself out of a narrow window 30 stories up and plummeting to her death. After a while, 2 people were charged with murder. It was a couple in around their 30s. The police suspected that the man had escorted my friend, and then his girlfriend or partner or whatever had showed up and was angry. Something or other happened, and maybe they murdered her, but wanted to cover it up, and so threw her body out the window. The thing that never adds up, though, is that the window, according to the police report, was really small. She would have had to have dived in head first and then squeeze her body really hard, like she wanted to kill herself. So if someone wanted to stop her, they could have easily pulled her out. No. I think these people must have done something, and they wanted to get rid of her quickly. So when they were done doing what they needed to do, they just threw her out the window and called it suicide. I don't believe they were ever charged, and it always pisses me off. My friend is gone. Be careful what you do out there, girls. So I served in the Marines from 2014 to 2016 and did one tour of Afghanistan. My best friend and I, Lance Corporal Sean Trevors, were stationed together in Camp Dwyer for a short amount of time to help with standard survey and watch. One day we went on a route convoy to deliver supplies to a unit about 30 kilometers away. Long story short, we came across a building while a sandstorm was developing towards the west. We were ordered to seek shelter until the sandstorm passed. Now when I say building, I mean this was a building that looked incredibly out of place. We were essentially in what I would call a small valley, and the nearest village was 3 to 4 clicks away. After about 10 minutes, we scanned the building and found no civils or combatants. 2 Marines were outside standing near the wall that was in front of the building, and 2 were on the roof, while the rest of us ate some chow and were just chatting on the 2nd floor. There were 4 floors, by the way. Then we heard shots fired, the same over the radio. We scrambled and got our gear. I went to the window, which was next to a door leading to a balcony of sorts. After what seemed like hours, we finally stopped hearing fire and received the cease order. We were told to check ammo and for wounded and to check the eliminated targets. I went to go look out for Sean and couldn't reach him on radio. I looked through the entire building and couldn't find him. I went to my squad leader and I was told he was last seen at the corner wall near the left of the building. I am sorry to say that I did find my friend and called for a corpsman, but was unable to stop the bleeding that was coming from his neck. I did everything I could to keep him alive. I applied pressure and tried to keep him conscious, but unfortunately I had to hold my nearest and dearest friend in my arms as he took his final breaths on Earth. I held him for as long as I could, before the corpsman finally told me he was really gone, and I watched over his remains until we got to base. Now that the sad part is told, I can tell you the paranormal part. It's been 6 years since my friend and fellow brother passed away, and ever since I left country and left the Marines, I've seen him in my dreams. And while I've been awake, I feel like I'm going crazy, but I also feel like it's my PTSD causing me to hallucinate. But I see him not in a bad way sometimes. I see him in dress blues, or Charlie sometimes. I'll occasionally see him with his Texas rodeo, complete with cowboy boots and hat to match, while dripping Copenhagen straight, or while in full combat gear with his M16. One day I was sitting at the kitchen eating dinner with my wife, who was 6 months pregnant, and I hear clear as day the word, "Hi," as if someone were inches away from me right near my ear and whispering it. I recently saw him at the grocery store of all places, and he gave me a half salute and walked and faded away. I don't know if he's maybe a sort of guardian angel now watching over me. Either way, I want to feel really open-minded about people's opinions about whether I'm seeing things, or whether I should go lock myself in a nut house. My friend's dad used to run a bodega somewhere in South America. He never did tell me where, but the events that happened disturbed me no end. One day his dad was just in the shop minding his own business. It was around 10 o'clock at night, and he was just getting ready to close up shop and go have his dinner with his wife. The house was connected to the shop, and just as he's about to do a few errands and tidy up before closing, a young man of about 23 busts into the shop. He immediately pulls a gun on this guy's dad and tells him that he wants all the money in the register. The dad laughs and says that he has very little today and that he's wasting his time. But this kid doesn't take no for an answer or a joke and immediately unloads his weapon into my dad's friend. Suffice to say, he didn't make it. The kid makes off with a couple of dollars worth of stuff and is caught 2 days later. He was sentenced to a long time in prison for his actions, and I don't know if he's out yet. My friend was very young when this happened, so he never really knew his dad.